Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, a place where curiosity slows its breathing, where questions are allowed to linger without needing immediate answers, and where stories unfold gently enough to carry you toward rest rather than away from it. This is a space for wandering minds and tired thoughts, for the kind of listening that doesn't demand effort, only presence. Tonight's journey drifts into a landscape that feels familiar at first glance, a place of trees and trails and open sky, yet one that has quietly unsettled people for decades without raising its voice. We're heading toward the Ozarks, a region many people think they already understand. Rolling hills instead of mountains, forests that don't feel imposing, trails that promise ease rather than challenge. It's the kind of place families camp, retirees hike, and weekend explorers wander without much concern. And yet, within this ordinary setting, something strange keeps happening. People go for walks and do not come back. Hikers step onto marked trails and seem to slip out of the story entirely. Search teams arrive, maps in hand, dogs ready, confidence intact, and still return with questions instead of answers. This isn't a tale of dramatic chases or sudden storms swallowing entire groups at once. It's quieter than that. A person steps ahead on a trail and is suddenly alone. A backpack is found, neatly placed. Footprints stop where the ground continues. Time stretches just enough for concern to turn into dread. The Ozark Triangle, as it's come to be called, isn't officially marked on any map. No signs announce its presence. No fence warns you when you cross into it. It exists more as a pattern than a place, a loose clustering of disappearances tied together not by spectacle, but by how ordinary they begin. Before we move further, take a moment to notice where you are right now. Are you listening from a quiet room, lights low, the day already loosening its grip on you? Or maybe you're somewhere else entirely, the sound of this voice accompanying a drive, a late shift, or a pause between thoughts. What time is it where you are? Not just the number on the clock, but the feeling of it. Early night, deep night, that soft edge where wakefulness and rest start to blur together. It feels fitting to talk about people who vanished into landscapes that refused to make noise as they did so. If you find this calm or curious, or simply a helpful way to let your thoughts slow down after a long day, consider liking the video or subscribing. It helps this small, quiet corner reach others who might be looking for the same kind of gentle company. There's no rush. Everything here moves at its own pace. The Ozarks stretch across parts of Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. The terrain isn't extreme by hiking standards. There are no towering peaks demanding technical skill, no glaciers, no altitude sickness waiting around the bend. Trails wind through hardwood forests, limestone bluffs, rivers that cut patiently through rock, and valleys that hold mist longer than expected in the early morning. To many hikers, this kind of landscape feels safe, familiar, forgiving, and that sense of ease may be part of what makes the disappearances so unsettling. When people imagine dangerous wilderness, they picture dramatic threats, sudden cliffs, avalanches, massive predators. The Ozarks offer none of that in obvious form. Instead, they offer subtlety, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that blends into the background so well that you only notice it when something is missing. Like a person who should be standing right there, just ahead on the trail, now inexplicably isn't. The idea of the Ozark Triangle didn't begin as folklore. It emerged slowly, assembled piece by families, park officials, volunteers and researchers who noticed similarities across cases that were supposed to be unrelated. A hiker disappears under clear weather conditions. Another vanishes on a well-marked trail. Search teams cover ground thoroughly, sometimes repeatedly, only to find nothing that explains what happened. No signs of struggle, no clear indication of direction. Occasionally, remains are found years later in places that were already searched, raising more questions than answers. What makes these cases linger isn't just the absence of people, it's the absence of process. Disappearances usually follow patterns, Injury leads to certain behaviours. Exposure leaves traces. Panic has a rhythm. But in many of these situations, the expected sequence simply doesn't appear. It's as if the story skips a page without warning, leaving investigators and families staring at a blank space where something should be. Hikers are often practical people. They prepare, they pack supplies, they check weather forecasts, they tell someone where they're going. Many of the individuals who vanished in this region were experienced outdoors, familiar with the terrain, comfortable with navigation. These weren't reckless adventurers chasing danger. They were people doing something they had done many times before, walking, exploring, breathing in forest air that smelled like leaves and stone and water. One of the most unsettling aspects of these disappearances is how quickly they happen. In some cases, someone walks ahead to check a viewpoint and never returns. In others, a short separation of minutes is all it takes. A group stops to adjust gear. Someone steps off briefly. When they turn back, the person is gone. No sound of running, no cry for help, just absence. Search and rescue operations in the Ozarks are not casual affairs. They involve trained professionals, volunteers, helicopters, thermal imaging, scent dogs, and systematic grid searches. And yet, again and again, teams report the same strange outcomes. Dogs lose the trail abruptly. Scents end in places that don't make sense. Footprints stop where the ground offers no reason for them to. It's not that nothing is found. It's that what is found doesn't explain what is missing. The land itself adds to the confusion. Beneath the forests lies a complex network of caves, sinkholes, and underground passages carved by water over thousands of years. Limestone dissolves quietly. Ground that looks solid may not always be what it appears. In some cases, these features provide plausible explanations. In others, they raise more questions than they answer. A cave opening might explain a fall, but not why no sound was heard. A sinkhole might explain a disappearance, but not why no trace was ever found afterward. Weather in the Ozarks can shift quickly, but many of the disappearances occurred under stable conditions. Clear skies, mild temperatures, no storms to disorient or erase tracks. This removes one of the most common explanations for wilderness accidents and leaves behind a quieter uncertainty. If nothing obvious went wrong, then what did? There is also the psychological side of being in forests that feel gentle rather than hostile. People relax, they lower their guard, attention drifts, time stretches in subtle ways, trails look similar, trees repeat patterns. A slight turn taken without thought can lead somewhere unfamiliar faster than expected. Getting lost doesn't always feel dramatic. Sometimes it feels like nothing at all until it's too late to recognise it. And then there are the stories locals tell, usually without embellishment. Not legends filled with monsters or curses, but observations passed along carefully. Warnings about certain areas where sound behaves strangely. Places where compasses don't seem reliable. Trails that seem to fold back on themselves. These stories are rarely offered to scare visitors. They're offered as reminders to pay attention, to respect the land even when it doesn't demand respect loudly. It's important to say this clearly. There is no single explanation accepted by everyone. The Ozark Triangle isn't a solved mystery waiting to be revealed. It's a collection of questions that refuse to organise themselves neatly. Some explanations are practical, some are psychological. Some drift into territory that makes people uncomfortable to discuss openly. All of them coexist because none of them fully resolve the pattern. What we're going to do together is move slowly through this landscape, not rushing to conclusions, not forcing meaning where it doesn't want to sit. We'll look at the geography, the search efforts, the human factors, and the theories that try, with varying degrees of success, to make sense of why people keep disappearing here. We'll pay attention to what repeats, what stands out, and what remains stubbornly unclear. This isn't about proving anything. It's about noticing, about staying with the uncertainty long enough to understand why it unsettles us. Disappearances bother us not just because someone is gone, but but because the rules we rely on seem to stop working. Cause and effect loosen their grip. Familiar landscapes stop behaving predictably, and that shakes something deeper than fear. It shakes trust. As we move forward, the focus won't be on sensationalism. There will be no sudden turns meant to jolt you awake. Instead, the story will unfold the way the forest does, gradually, one step leading to another. Sometimes the path will feel clear. Sometimes it will narrow. Sometimes it will open unexpectedly into questions that don't ask to be answered right away. So imagine yourself standing at the edge of a trail just before entering the woods. The light is steady, the air is still, everything looks exactly as it should. Nothing feels wrong, and yet somewhere deeper in, stories have ended without endings. Not loudly, not violently, just quietly enough to leave room for wondering. We'll take that first step now, moving from the idea of the Ozark Triangle into the land itself, where trails promise direction, and the forest, patiently, does not. The idea of a triangle usually comes with certainty. 3 points, 3 edges, something you can draw with a ruler and label with confidence. The Ozark Triangle has none of that. There are no official borders, no signs at trailheads, no agreement on exactly where it begins or ends, and yet, when people talk about it, they talk as if it's real in a way that doesn't require lines. Not a shape you can trace, but a pattern you notice only after looking back. When the phrase first started circulating, it wasn't meant to sound mysterious. It was a shorthand, a way to refer to a loose region where an unusual number of disappearances seemed to cluster. Southern Missouri, northern Arkansas, parts of eastern Oklahoma. A wide, uneven sweep of land tied together not by roads or fences, but by stories that followed a familiar rhythm. Someone enters the woods, someone does not come out. The space in between refuses to explain itself. What makes the concept unsettling is not that the area is remote. Much of it isn't. These are not vast, untouched wilderness zones where people vanish without witnesses. Many of the trails pass through state parks, conservation areas, and public lands that see steady foot traffic. Campgrounds fill up on weekends. Families picnic near trailheads. Locals jog sections of path they've walked since childhood. This is not a place where isolation feels inevitable. And yet, when researchers and journalists began mapping cases, something odd emerged. The disappearances didn't scatter evenly across the Ozarks. They seemed to gather loosely, forming a rough triangle shape when plotted on a map. Not precise enough to feel intentional, but consistent enough to raise eyebrows. The same counties appeared again and again, the same forests, the same rivers cutting through limestone hills. It wasn't proof of anything, but it was enough to invite a closer look. The triangle has no official name in government records. You won't find it in park documentation. Rangers don't brief visitors about it. That absence of recognition is part of what allows it to exist quietly. Without formal acknowledgement, each case remains isolated on paper. An accident here, a missing person there, a search that came up empty somewhere else. Only when someone takes the time to step back does the larger shape begin to suggest itself. People often ask whether the triangle is real or just a coincidence. It's a reasonable question. Humans are very good at seeing patterns, sometimes too good. We connect dots even when they don't belong together, but pattern recognition isn't the same as imagination. When enough similar events occur under similar conditions, dismissing them outright becomes its own form of bias. The Ozarks themselves complicate the discussion. This is an ancient landscape, older than many mountain ranges, worn down over millions of years rather than thrust upward dramatically. The hills roll instead of rise. The forests feel dense but not oppressive. Streams carve gentle paths that belie the complexity beneath. Under the surface, water has been quietly dissolving rock, creating a hidden world of caves, tunnels, and voids that don't announce themselves above ground. This geology matters because it creates uncertainty without spectacle. In more dramatic environments, danger is visible. You can see the cliff edge, You can hear the river roaring. In the Ozarks, risk hides in normalcy. A patch of ground that looks solid may not be. A slope that seems manageable may funnel someone into a narrow ravine. A trail that feels obvious may split subtly, leading in two directions that look equally correct for longer than expected. If the triangle has edges, they are defined less by distance and more by repetition. Certain features appear again and again in disappearance cases. Proximity to water, limestone formations, dense forest cover that limits long sight lines, areas where trails intersect or loop. None of these are unusual on their own. Together they create a landscape that offers many ways to step slightly off course without realizing it. There is also the human factor of familiarity. People tend to be more cautious in environments that feel hostile. In deserts, in high mountains, in deep winter conditions, hikers prepare meticulously and move deliberately. In the Ozarks, the land doesn't demand that level of vigilance. It invites comfort, and comfort can dull awareness just enough to matter. Another complicating factor is jurisdiction. The Ozark region spans multiple states, each with its own park systems, search protocols and record-keeping practices. When someone goes missing near a state border, responsibility can blur. Data doesn't always travel smoothly across agencies. Cases are categorized differently. What looks like a cluster from one perspective can remain fragmented from another. This fragmentation contributes to the sense that the triangle is more rumor than reality. Without a centralized database, patterns are harder to confirm officially. Families talk to each other. Volunteers compare notes. Researchers compile lists from news reports and public records. The picture that emerges depends heavily on who is looking and how thorough they are. Still, some consistencies are hard to ignore. Many of the missing were found without key items or not found at all. Some vanished within sight of others. Some left behind gear that suggested they were not planning to go far. These details recur often enough to feel like more than chance, even if they don't point cleanly to a single cause. It's worth noting that the triangle doesn't behave like a trap. People enter it every day and return safely. Thousands of hikers walk these trails without incident. That normalcy is essential to the mystery. If the area were consistently dangerous, the explanation would be simpler. It's the selectiveness, the unpredictability that makes the disappearances unsettling. Some locals resist the triangle label entirely. They argue that it exaggerates the risk and disrespects the land. To them, the Ozarks are home, not a headline. They point out that missing persons cases happen everywhere, and that focusing on one region distorts reality. Others quietly acknowledge that something feels off in certain places, even if they can't articulate why. Maps themselves can be misleading. A drawn triangle suggests fixed boundaries, but the real world doesn't operate that way. People don't disappear because they crossed an invisible line. They disappear because a combination of terrain, timing, human behavior, and chance aligned in a particular moment. The triangle is a way of talking about that alignment, not a literal zone of danger. There's also the psychological weight of labels. Once a place gains a reputation, it changes how people experience it. Hikers who know the stories may interpret normal sounds as ominous. Searchers may approach areas with preconceived expectations. Families may struggle with the idea that a loved one vanished in a place others now associate with mystery rather than accident. At the same time, naming something can be a way of coping. Giving shape to uncertainty makes it feel slightly more manageable. The triangle becomes a container for fear, confusion, and grief that might otherwise feel scattered and overwhelming. It allows people to say, "This keeps happening here," instead of nowhere and everywhere at once. The lack of lines on the map also reflects the nature of disappearance itself. There is rarely a clean boundary between before and after. One moment, a person is present. The next, they are not. No clear threshold marks the transition. No sign announces that something irreversible has occurred. The triangle mirrors that ambiguity. It exists only when you look for it, and even then, it refuses to stay still. Some researchers have tried to narrow the triangle down, proposing specific anchor points based on the density of cases. Others reject the shape entirely, preferring to talk about corridors or clusters. The debate itself underscores how difficult it is to pin down something that resists definition by design. What remains consistent is the feeling that certain areas produce questions more readily than answers, that searchers conclude with silence rather than resolution, that people familiar with the land can still vanish in ways that don't fit the usual patterns of injury, exposure, or misadventure. The triangle isn't about drawing boundaries. It's about noticing that something repeats without explanation. It's about acknowledging that familiarity does not guarantee safety, and that landscapes can be deceptive not because they are malicious, but because they are indifferent. As we move deeper into this story, the focus will shift from the idea of the triangle to the experiences within it. The trails people walked, the decisions they made, the moments when something small went unnoticed. Understanding why hikers keep disappearing here means paying attention to details that are easy to dismiss when everything feels normal. The Ozark Triangle doesn't announce itself when you enter. It doesn't warn you that you've arrived somewhere different. It looks like forest and sky and earth, the same as it always has. And that may be the most unsettling part. There is no moment where you know you've crossed into a place where stories end abruptly. There is only the quiet continuation of the path, until suddenly, for someone, it stops. From here, the natural question becomes not where the triangle is, but what it feels like to move through it. What hikers expect when they step onto these trails, and how those expectations can quietly shape what happens next. The first steps into the woods are rarely dramatic. They don't feel like a beginning in the way stories usually begin. There is no sudden shift, no clear signal that something important has started. Most of the time, it feels like a continuation of ordinary life, just carried a little farther from pavement and routine. Boots touch dirt instead of concrete. The air smells greener. Sound changes slightly, softened by leaves and distance. For hikers in the Ozarks, this moment is especially unremarkable because the woods are so familiar. Many of the people who disappeared here had walked similar trails dozens of times. Some lived nearby. Some grew up exploring these forests as children. They knew what poison ivy looked like. They knew how to recognize limestone outcrops and shallow creeks. They understood the rhythm of the terrain, the way hills rose and fell gently rather than sharply. Nothing about the first step suggested danger. If anything, they suggested comfort. Familiarity has a strange effect on the mind. It creates a sense of permission to relax. When you step into a place you've been before, your attention narrows. You stop actively scanning for hazards. You stop double-checking your footing. You let your thoughts drift, because nothing has gone wrong here before. This isn't carelessness, it's efficiency. The brain conserves energy by assuming that familiar environments will behave as expected. In the Ozarks, that assumption often feels justified. Trails are usually well marked. Elevation changes are manageable. The forest doesn't close in aggressively. Light filters through leaves in a way that feels open rather than claustrophobic. Even the sounds are gentle. Birds, wind, insects. Nothing that triggers alarm. For many hikers, the woods feel less like wilderness and more like an extension of home. This sense of ease shapes behaviour in subtle ways. People walk a little faster. They check their phones less often. They wander slightly off trail to look at a rock formation or follow the sound of water. They assume they can always step back onto the path without effort, and most of the time, they're right. But the first steps also set the tone for everything that follows. The decisions made early, often unconsciously, determine how much margin for error remains later. A hiker who starts with the belief that nothing unexpected will happen is less likely to prepare for the unexpected. They may carry less water. They may skip a map because the trail is familiar. They may not tell anyone exactly where they're going because it seems unnecessary. In disappearance cases, these early choices rarely stand out at first. They only become visible in hindsight when searchers reconstruct the day. Someone planned a short walk, someone left their phone in the car, someone assumed they'd be back before dark. None of these choices are unusual. Taken together, they form a pattern of quiet confidence that can become vulnerability without announcing itself. The woods themselves reinforce this confidence. The Ozark forests are not uniform walls of trees. They open and close rhythmically. Clearings appear, trails widen and narrow. The land feels readable, even when you're not actively reading it. This can create the impression that navigation is intuitive, that you'll always know which way to go because the environment feels legible. But legibility is not the same as reliability. Forests change subtly over time, trails shift, trees fall, seasonal growth alters sightlines. A path that felt obvious last year may split differently this year. A turn you remember may look slightly off, but not enough to trigger concern. These small discrepancies are easy to rationalize. You tell yourself you're just misremembering. You keep walking. Many hikers describe a moment later when something felt slightly wrong, but not wrong enough to stop. A trail felt quieter than expected. The ground underfoot changed texture. Landmarks didn't line up exactly as they remembered. These moments are rarely dramatic. They don't come with a sense of danger. They come with mild confusion, easily dismissed. The first steps also carry expectations. People expect progress. They expect movement to lead somewhere. Trails promise destinations, even if they're vague. A viewpoint, a creek crossing, a loop that eventually returns you to where you started. When those expectations are gently violated, the mind often adapts rather than resists. You adjust your internal map instead of questioning it. In the Ozarks, this adjustment can happen quickly because the terrain doesn't punish small mistakes immediately. A wrong turn doesn't drop you off a cliff. It leads you into more forest. More of the same. Trees look like trees. Hills look like hills. Without obvious feedback, it's easy to keep moving in the wrong direction while feeling perfectly fine. Search teams often note how little distress seems evident in early disappearance timelines. There's no frantic phone call, no attempt to signal for help, no sign of panic. This suggests that, for a time, the missing person didn't realize they were in trouble. They were still operating under the assumption that they were simply walking through familiar woods. This assumption can persist longer than people expect. Humans are remarkably good at normalizing gradual change. If the forest slowly becomes less familiar, the brain explains it away. Maybe this section looks different. Maybe the trail has been rerouted. Maybe I'm closer to the creek than I thought. Each explanation buys a little more time before concern sets in. The first steps also establish a rhythm. Walking settles into a pace. Breathing sinks. Thoughts drift. This rhythm can be soothing, almost meditative. Attention turns inward. The body moves on autopilot. While this can be pleasant, it reduces situational awareness. You notice less. You respond more slowly to subtle cues. Experienced hikers are not immune to this. In fact, experience can deepen the effect. Confidence replaces vigilance. You've handled this before. You know how this goes. That confidence is usually earned, but it can become misleading when conditions differ slightly from memory. Another factor is social dynamics. When people hike together, the first steps often involve conversation. Talking distracts. People follow each other without actively navigating. If the person in front takes a wrong turn, others may follow without question. No one wants to interrupt the flow by stopping to check a map when everything feels fine. In solo hikes, the dynamic shifts inward. Without conversation, thoughts fill the space. People replay plans, think about work, reflect on personal things. The woods become background rather than focus. This inward attention can make it harder to notice external changes until they're more pronounced. The Ozarks encourage this inward drift because they don't demand constant negotiation. There's no need to calculate each step, no technical obstacles. The walking feels easy, and ease can be deceptive. There is also the matter of sound. Forests absorb noise. In the Ozarks, the terrain and vegetation muffle echoes. A person can be surprisingly close to others and still not be heard. This matters because it creates a false sense of solitude and a false sense of security. You may assume that if something goes wrong, someone will hear you. That assumption doesn't always hold. Many disappearance cases involve brief separations. Someone walks ahead. Someone stops to rest. The distance feels small. The environment feels safe. The separation doesn't register as a risk. But in forests, distance is elastic. A few minutes can become disorienting quickly, especially if terrain obscures sight lines. The first steps also mark the transition from managed space to semi-wild space. Trailheads are often tidy, signs are clear, parking areas are maintained. Once you move past that threshold, maintenance decreases. Markers become less frequent. The responsibility for navigation shifts subtly from the environment to the individual. This shift is easy to miss because it happens gradually. When search teams reconstruct disappearances, they often start at the beginning. Where did the person park? Which trail did they intend to take? How far were they planning to go? These questions seem straightforward, but answers are often incomplete. People don't always remember exactly which trail they chose. They don't always stick to the plan they described earlier. The first steps may already deviate slightly from intention without conscious awareness. Time perception also changes early in a hike. Without clocks, minutes stretch and compress. People lose track of how long they've been walking. This makes it harder to gauge distance travelled. You think you've only been out a short time. In reality, you may be farther from the trailhead than expected. The woods don't correct you. They don't provide clear feedback. They simply continue. This continuity can be comforting, but it also removes urgency. There's no obvious point where you realise you've gone too far. Only a gradual sense that things are taking longer than planned. For those who disappeared, the first steps were likely the least memorable part of their day. Nothing unusual happened. Nothing worth noting. That ordinariness is what makes the later absence so difficult to comprehend. Families search for a moment when things changed. Often, there isn't one. Instead, there is a series of small, unremarkable choices layered on top of each other. Walk a little farther. Follow a side path. Keep going even when the trail looks slightly different. Assume familiarity equals safety. Each choice makes sense in isolation. Together, they can lead someone quietly away from where anyone expects them to be. The Ozark Woods don't feel like a place where stories end abruptly. They feel like a place where stories meander, where nothing seems urgent enough to demand a course correction. That is why the first steps matter so much. They establish a relationship with the environment that persists until something breaks that trust. And when that break happens, it doesn't announce itself loudly. It begins as a mild discrepancy, a pause, a glance around, a moment of recalibration. By the time concern becomes clear, the familiar woods may no longer feel quite so familiar, and the distance covered since those first easy steps may be greater than anyone realizes. From here, the story naturally turns toward what happens when familiarity starts to slip, when trails that once made sense begin to behave differently, and when the quiet confidence of the early walk gives way to something less certain, often without a clear dividing line. There is a moment that rarely gets talked about in disappearance cases, partly because it's difficult to define, and partly because it doesn't feel dramatic enough to matter at the time. It's the moment when a trail stops making sense, not all at once, but in pieces. Not a dead end, not a clear wrong turn, just a subtle mismatch between expectation and reality that arrives quietly and stays understated. Trails are meant to guide without demanding attention. They work best when you don't have to think about them. You follow the worn earth, the flattened leaves, the occasional marker, and your body understands what to do before your mind does. In the Ozarks, trails are often informal in character, shaped as much by habit as by design. Some are maintained regularly, others exist because people have walked them long enough for the land to remember. This creates a system that functions on trust. You trust that the path leads somewhere coherent. You trust that if you stay on it, you'll eventually arrive at a known point or loop back to where you started. That trust is rarely questioned until something feels slightly off. The first sign is often ambiguity. A trail that splits without clear signage, a section that narrows until it's no longer obvious which way the path continues. Leaves cover the ground evenly, erasing the distinction between trail and forest floor. Nothing about this feels alarming. It feels like a momentary inconvenience, easily solved by choosing what looks most reasonable. The problem is that reasonable is subjective. People tend to choose the path that looks easiest, widest, or most familiar, even if that choice is unconsciously influenced by expectation rather than evidence. If you believe you're heading north, you'll favour paths that seem to continue north, even when there's no clear confirmation. In the Ozarks, this tendency is amplified by the terrain. Hills and valleys bend sight lines. Trees repeat visual patterns. Rocks look similar to other rocks you passed earlier. It's possible to feel oriented while being subtly misaligned. The land doesn't contradict you strongly enough to force correction. Trails also change over time. Erosion reshapes them. Fallen trees redirect foot traffic. Seasonal growth obscures sections that were clear months earlier. A hiker relying on memory may find that the trail no longer matches what they recall, but instead of questioning their direction, they question their memory. That hesitation favours continued movement rather than stopping. Stopping feels unnecessary. After all, you're still on a trail, or something that looks like one. You can see where others have walked. You can still move forward comfortably. There is no signal that says you should turn around. In many cases, turning around feels more disruptive than continuing. This is where trails stop being guides and start becoming suggestions. They hint at direction without committing to it. They promise coherence without guaranteeing it. And when that promise weakens, the burden of navigation shifts quietly onto the hiker. Search and rescue professionals often note that people rarely recognize the exact moment they became lost. Instead, they recall a gradual realization that something wasn't lining up, a landmark that didn't appear when expected, a sense that the walk was taking longer than planned, a feeling that the forest looked slightly different than it should. This gradualness matters. Sudden disorientation triggers alarm. Gradual disorientation invites rationalization. You tell yourself you misjudged the distance. You assume the trail loops more than expected. You keep walking because stopping would require admitting uncertainty, and uncertainty feels disproportionate to the situation. In disappearance cases, this stage often leaves no physical trace. There's no evidence of panic, no erratic movement. Footprints continue in a steady pattern. This suggests that the person was still calm, still believing the situation was manageable. Another factor is how trails intersect. In the Ozarks, many paths cross informally. Animal trails, old logging roads, and unofficial shortcuts crisscross maintained routes. These intersections are rarely marked clearly. To an untrained eye, they all look like viable paths. Animal trails are especially deceptive. They are worn, continuous, and often lead downhill toward water. Humans instinctively favour these paths because they feel natural. But animal trails don't care about returning you to where you started. They care about efficiency, not orientation. Old logging roads pose a different problem. They can be wide and obvious, suggesting human use, but they may no longer connect to maintained trail systems. Following one can carry you farther from familiar territory than expected, especially if it curves gradually rather than sharply. Trails can also disappear temporarily due to terrain features. Crossing a creek, walking over exposed rock, or passing through dense undergrowth can erase visual cues. On the other side, the trail may reappear slightly offset. If you don't pick it up immediately, you may continue on a parallel path without realizing it. This phenomenon, known informally among hikers as trail drift, happens quietly. You believe you're still on the trail because your movement hasn't changed. You're still walking forward. The forest still looks passable. Only later does it become clear that the trail you thought you were following had ended or shifted. In the Ozarks, limestone formations add another layer of confusion. Rock outcrops can channel movement in specific directions. You follow the easiest route through them, assuming it aligns with the trail. But ease does not always equal correctness. The land guides you according to gravity and erosion, not your intended destination. Maps, when used, don't always help immediately. Many hikers carry maps but rely on them only when something feels clearly wrong. At the stage where trails stop making sense, the feeling is often too subtle to prompt a check. You feel slightly unsure, not lost. Checking a map also requires stopping, unfolding it, orienting it correctly, and admitting that you need it. In environments that feel familiar, people delay that step. They trust their sense of direction longer than they should. Technology introduces another complication. GPS devices and phones can fail in forested terrain. Signal drops, batteries drain. When devices give inconsistent readings, hikers may dismiss them rather than adjust behaviour. If your phone says you're off trail but everything looks fine, you may assume the technology is wrong. When trails stop making sense, time perception becomes distorted. You think you've only been walking a short while. You underestimate how far you've gone. This makes the idea of turning back feel unnecessary. Why retrace your steps when you're surely just a few minutes from clarity? Searchers often find that missing hikers travelled farther than expected before realising something was wrong. This distance complicates searches because it expands the area that needs to be covered. The longer a person walks while disoriented, the larger the potential search radius becomes. There is also the issue of commitment. Once you've walked a certain distance, turning back feels like admitting a mistake. Humans are prone to escalation of commitment. You continue on a course of action because you've already invested in it, even when evidence suggests reconsideration. In forests, this manifests as continued forward movement. You tell yourself the trail will straighten out. You expect the next bend to resolve confusion. Each step reinforces the decision to keep going. Environmental cues in the Ozarks don't always contradict this mindset. The forest remains passable. There are no obvious barriers. Water is often nearby. Shelter feels available. Nothing forces urgency. The environment doesn't escalate the situation quickly enough to trigger corrective action. When confusion deepens, some hikers begin to improvise. They aim downhill, assuming it will lead to water or civilization. They follow streams, believing they connect to larger waterways. These strategies can work in some environments. In others, they lead deeper into remote areas. Following water in the Ozarks can be misleading. Streams branch, they loop, they disappear underground. Limestone allows water to vanish into sinkholes, leaving dry channels that go nowhere obvious. A hiker following a creek may find it fading out rather than leading forward. Another common response is to attempt to backtrack mentally rather than physically. You replay the route in your head, trying to remember where you turned. This internal navigation can feel productive, but it doesn't correct your physical position. Meanwhile, you continue walking. When search teams analyze tracks, they sometimes see this pattern. Footprints that hesitate, pairs that curve erratically but remain controlled. This suggests cognitive uncertainty rather than panic. The person was trying to solve a problem, not escape one. Trails stop making sense long before people realize they're truly lost. This gap between confusion and recognition is critical. It's where many disappearances take shape. The person is still calm enough to make decisions, but not alert enough to make the best ones. Once recognition arrives, the situation changes. Anxiety increases. Movement patterns shift. But by then, the landscape may no longer offer easy options. The distance from familiar ground may be greater than expected. Daylight may be fading. Energy may be lower. The Ozark Triangle cases often hinge on this transition point. The trail stopped making sense earlier, but the response lagged. That lag allowed disorientation to deepen without resistance. It's also worth noting that trails are social constructs. They exist because people agree to use them. When usage patterns change, trails degrade or multiply. In popular areas, this creates braided paths, multiple options where one once existed. Each option feels valid because others have walked it. This multiplicity can overwhelm intuitive navigation. Without clear markers, choosing becomes guesswork. Guesswork feels acceptable when stakes seem low. In familiar woods, stakes rarely feel high until they suddenly are. When people disappear, investigators look for a dramatic moment, a fall, a medical event, an attack. But often, the story doesn't include one. It includes a series of small mismatches that never triggered a decisive response. The trail didn't end. It just stopped being reliable, and the hiker didn't realize the difference until reliability mattered. Understanding this stage is essential because it reframes disappearance as a process rather than an event. People don't vanish because something extraordinary happens. They vanish because ordinary systems fail quietly. As we move forward, the focus shifts from confusion to absence. From the moment when trails lose coherence to the moment when someone is no longer where they should be. The shift is marked not by drama, but by silence. Silence is one of the most unsettling details in these cases, not because silence is unusual in forests, but because of when it appears. People expect noise when something goes wrong. A shout, a crash, a call for help that echoes through trees and draws attention. What repeatedly unsettles investigators, families and search teams in the Ozarks is how often none of that happens. Someone is present, then they are not, and the space between those two states is soundless. Forests are quiet by default, but not empty. There is always movement. Wind shifts leaves, birds call to one another, insects hum, even footsteps have texture. Against that background, sudden noise stands out. A snapped branch, a raised voice, a fall against rock. The absence of these sounds is not just notable, it is puzzling. Many disappearance cases involve companions who are nearby, sometimes very nearby. A hiker walks a short distance ahead. A partner stops to tie a boot. A friend pauses to take a photo. The separation feels minor. Seconds or minutes pass. When the others catch up, the person is gone. When asked later, the same detail comes up again and again. They didn't hear anything. This detail is easy to dismiss at first. People assume they must have missed something. Maybe there was a sound they didn't register. Maybe the forest absorbed it. But when trained searchers review these accounts, the silence becomes harder to ignore. Humans are remarkably sensitive to sudden changes in sound, especially voices calling out nearby. Even distracted, even talking, most people would notice a shout for help from a short distance away. In some cases, the missing person carried equipment that would normally make noise if dropped. A backpack with metal clips, a water bottle, trekking poles. None of it was heard. No crash, no scramble, just absence. This raises uncomfortable questions. If someone fell, why was there no sound? If someone called out, why was it not heard? If someone ran, why were there no footsteps breaking rhythm? Each possibility has explanations, but none of them feel complete on their own. The Ozark terrain plays a role here, but not in an obvious way. Sound behaves strangely in forests, especially in areas with uneven elevation, dense vegetation, and rock formations. Sound waves don't travel in straight lines. They bend, scatter, and get absorbed. A shout can carry far in one direction and vanish in another. A fall can be muffled by soft ground, leaves, or moss. Limestone adds another layer. Rock faces can deflect sound downward or sideways. Ravines can swallow noise. Caves and crevices can absorb it entirely. A person slipping into a narrow opening may make very little noise, especially if vegetation breaks the fall. Still, this does not explain every case. Silence persists even when conditions suggest sound should have carried, even when distances were short, even when multiple people were listening. One reason silence is so troubling is because it removes the sense of event. Disappearances feel less like accidents and more like interruptions. A conversation ends mid-thought. A group dynamic breaks without transition. There is no climax, no peak moment to point to and say, "This is where it happened." Search and rescue professionals rely heavily on sound in emergencies, calls for help, whistles, banging objects together. These cues guide search efforts and help establish timelines. When there is no sound, there is no anchor point, no last known signal. The story dissolves into uncertainty. In some cases, silence may reflect rapid incapacitation, a sudden medical event, loss of consciousness. These scenarios are possible and sometimes supported by medical history. But even then, the lack of secondary noise remains odd. A collapse often produces sound, a body hitting the ground, gear shifting, something. Another possibility is that people don't always shout when disoriented. There is a common assumption that someone lost will immediately call for help. In reality, many people hesitate. They don't want to overreact. They assume they can solve the problem themselves. They conserve energy. They stay quiet. Silence, in this sense, is a choice, a temporary one, but meaningful. People may wait for clarity before signalling. They may fear embarrassment more than danger at first. This delay can extend long enough that help is no longer nearby. There is also the psychological effect of isolation. When someone believes they are still close to others, they may not shout because they expect reunion any moment. The idea that something is seriously wrong has not yet formed. Silence feels appropriate because the situation doesn't feel urgent. Companions, meanwhile, may assume the missing person is just ahead, or just behind. They don't call out immediately either. Everyone waits. Silence stretches. By the time someone speaks, the distance may already be greater than expected. The forest reinforces this quiet. Unlike urban environments, there is no constant background noise to mask sudden sounds. Ironically, this makes silence feel normal. You don't notice the absence of sound because quiet is already present. In disappearance cases where people were alone, silence becomes even harder to interpret. There is no witness to confirm what did or did not happen. Investigators look for physical evidence instead. Disturbed ground, broken vegetation, signs of struggle. Often, there are none. This lack of disturbance suggests controlled movement rather than chaos. The person did not thrash or run wildly. They moved deliberately, at least for a time. That deliberateness aligns with the idea that they did not perceive immediate danger. Silence also affects search behaviour. Without auditory clues, searchers rely on visual patterns. They scan for unnatural breaks in the landscape, a displaced rock, a scuffed patch of dirt. In dense forest, these signs are subtle and easily missed. Dogs, often used to track scent, sometimes lose trails abruptly. The scent does not fade gradually. It stops. This can happen for many reasons: weather, terrain, water crossings. But when combined with silence, it creates the impression of an interruption rather than a gradual departure. Families often fixate on this aspect. They replay the moment when someone should have heard something. They imagine calling out. They wonder why no one did. Silence becomes a space filled with imagined alternatives, each more painful than the last. The absence of sound also fuels speculation. People ask whether someone could have been taken, whether human or animal. These theories are controversial and often unsupported by evidence. Large animals capable of silently removing a person are rare in the region. Human involvement would likely leave signs. Yet silence invites these questions because it leaves so little else to work with. It's important to approach this carefully. Silence does not imply something extraordinary. It implies a lack of information. But humans are uncomfortable with gaps. We fill them instinctively. Some researchers point out that many accidents are quieter than we imagine. Falls can be surprisingly soft. Voices can be lost quickly. Panic does not always produce sound. The reality of emergencies is often less cinematic than expected. Still, the repetition of silence across cases makes it hard to ignore. It is not a one-off detail. It appears again and again, regardless of age, experience, or location within the Ozarks. Silence also delays response. Without a clear moment of distress, companions don't know when to worry. Search efforts begin later. The window for rescue narrows without anyone realizing it. By the time concern becomes certainty, the forest has had time to reset. Footprints soften, sounds return to normal, the land absorbs what happened without comment. Disappearance, in this context, is not a loud rupture. It is a quiet erasure. A person moves out of the shared sensory field without triggering alarms. The world continues as if nothing has changed. This quietness makes resolution difficult. There is no moment to rewind to, no sound to trace backward, just a before and an after with nothing audible in between. As we move forward, the story shifts toward what happens once silence is noticed, the point when absence becomes undeniable, when people realize that waiting has gone on too long and the quiet has become something else entirely. Maps offer reassurance long before they offer guidance. The moment someone unfolds one or taps a screen, there is a feeling that the situation has shape again. Lines appear. Symbols anchor uncertainty. Even when the landscape itself feels confusing, the map promises order. It suggests that the world can still be understood if you look at it from the right angle. In the Ozarks, that promise often holds, at least at first. Trail maps show loops, junctions, elevation changes, water sources. They imply intention. Someone planned this. Someone knew where paths should go. When hikers carry maps into familiar woods, they rarely expect to rely on them heavily. The map becomes a backup rather than a primary tool, something that stays folded until needed. That delay matters. Maps work best when used early, not when confusion has already taken hold. But when the woods feel friendly and the trail seems clear, checking a map feels unnecessary. It can even feel disruptive, like stopping the flow of a walk that hasn't yet given you a reason to stop. When people finally do consult their maps, they often expect confirmation rather than correction. They're looking to reassure themselves that they're on the right path, not to reconsider their direction entirely. This shapes how information is interpreted. If the map seems to agree even loosely with what they see, they move on. If it doesn't, they may assume the map is outdated or that they're misreading it. The Ozarks complicate this because many maps are in fact imperfect. Trails change. Some routes are unofficial but heavily used. Others exist on paper but are barely visible on the ground. Maintenance levels vary widely between parks, counties and states. A map printed a few years ago may not reflect current conditions accurately. Even digital maps introduce uncertainty. GPS accuracy fluctuates under dense tree cover. Signal drops in valleys. Batteries drain. A device that shows your position as a small blue dot may lag behind your actual movement, updating slowly or erratically. When the digital representation doesn't match what your eyes see, it's tempting to trust the physical world over the screen. Maps also require interpretation. Symbols must be translated into reality. A thin line representing a trail doesn't convey how obvious that trail will be on the ground. A dotted line doesn't tell you how steep or overgrown it is. Contour lines suggest elevation, but not how that elevation feels underfoot. For hikers who aren't accustomed to frequent navigation, this translation can be surprisingly difficult. You may recognize landmarks on the map but struggle to match them to the forest around you. A bend in a creek may look different from expected. A ridge may feel longer than it appears on paper. These discrepancies create doubt, and doubt slows decision-making. In disappearance cases, maps often become central objects. Investigators ask whether the missing person carried one. If so, did they know how to use it? Was it found later, and if so, where? Sometimes maps are discovered neatly folded, suggesting they were not consulted. Other times they are found open or damaged, implying use during distress. A common misconception is that having a map prevents getting lost. In reality, maps reduce risk only when paired with frequent orientation. This means stopping regularly, checking position, and adjusting course as needed. In familiar woods, people rarely do this. They rely on recognition rather than measurement. Recognition fails quietly. A trail looks like it should. A bend feels right. You keep moving. By the time you realize something is wrong, the map no longer matches your mental picture of where you are. At that point, the map's promise feels hollow. Another complication is scale. Many trail maps are designed for overview rather than precision. They show general routes, not every spur, animal trail, or erosion path. When hikers encounter unmarked intersections, the map offers no guidance. You are left to guess which line corresponds to which path, if any. Guessing feels manageable when stakes feel low. You assume that if you choose incorrectly, you'll notice quickly and adjust. But trails that don't deliver often fail gradually. They don't announce that they're wrong. They simply lead you somewhere else, and that somewhere else still feels plausible. Maps also assume a static world. They don't account for fallen trees that redirect foot traffic. They don't show seasonal changes that obscure landmarks. They don't reflect the way people actually move through landscapes over time. In the Ozarks, where unofficial paths proliferate, this gap between representation and reality can be significant. There is also the issue of orientation. Maps require you to know which direction you're facing. In forests with limited sight lines, this is not always obvious. Without a compass, or without checking one, it's easy to misalign the map. A trail that looks like it should go east may actually head southeast. That small error compounds with distance. Compasses, when carried, introduce their own challenges. They must be used correctly. Magnetic interference from metal objects or nearby rock formations can affect reading slightly. Most hikers don't calibrate for these issues because they rarely need to. When confusion arises, they may not trust the compass enough to change direction decisively. Paths that don't deliver are particularly deceptive because they often look intentional. They are worn, they are clear, they feel used. This visual confirmation reinforces belief that you're still on a planned route. The map's failure to acknowledge the path becomes easier to dismiss than the path itself. In some cases, hikers follow paths that appear on older maps, but no longer connect as expected. Logging roads, for example, may have been repurposed, blocked, or partially reclaimed by forest. Following one can lead to dead ends far from maintained trails. Dead ends in forests don't feel like dead ends. They feel like pauses. You expect the trail to continue just beyond the next rise. You walk a little farther to check. Each step increases distance from known points, even as you believe you're close to resolution. Maps also fail to convey effort. A trail that looks short on paper may be exhausting in practice. Hills accumulate. Terrain slows progress. This mismatch between expectation and reality affects judgment. You think you should have reached a landmark by now. You assume the map is wrong rather than considering that you may be off course. When search teams reconstruct routes, they often overlay maps with known trails and estimated walking speeds. They try to infer where a missing person might have gone based on intention. But intention is not always realized. People adapt plans on the fly. They take shortcuts. They explore side paths. These deviations are rarely documented. The promise of a map is that it reflects intention. The reality of a path is that it reflects behavior. When those diverge, the map loses authority. There is also a cognitive effect at play. When people consult maps under stress, their ability to process spatial information declines. Anxiety narrows attention. Working memory shortens. Complex tasks become harder. Interpreting contour lines or route options feels overwhelming. In these moments, hikers may default to simpler heuristics. Follow downhill, follow water, follow the most worn path. These strategies reduce cognitive load, but increase risk in environments where such cues are unreliable. Maps can also create false confidence. A hiker may believe they are closer to help than they actually are because the map shows a road nearby. What the map doesn't show is the terrain between the trail and that road. Dense vegetation, steep slopes, private land boundaries, physical barriers that make direct travel difficult. This perceived proximity can encourage continued movement rather than stopping. You believe you're almost out. You push forward. The gap between expectation and reality widens. In disappearance cases, this push often continues until energy runs low. Fatigue sets in. Decision-making degrades further. At that point, the map's promise feels distant, almost irrelevant. The physical world dominates attention. Some missing persons are found with maps still in their possession, suggesting they never reached a point where they felt compelled to abandon them. Others are found without maps, perhaps having left them behind intentionally to move faster, or because they believed they no longer needed them. There are cases where maps are found carefully placed, undamaged, as if set down deliberately. These details are hard to interpret. They may indicate rest, they may indicate resignation, or they may simply reflect a practical choice made without dramatic intent. Paths that don't deliver are not malicious. They don't trap hikers intentionally. They exist because landscapes evolve and human use adapts imperfectly. But when combined with delayed map use and overconfidence born of familiarity, they can carry people quietly away from safety. The Ozark Triangle cases highlight this disconnect between representation and experience. Maps suggest structure, paths suggest continuity. When both fail to align, the hiker is left navigating an environment that feels both understandable and uncooperative. Understanding this stage is crucial because it explains why many disappearances do not involve reckless behaviour. People are not ignoring tools, they are trusting them. They are acting reasonably based on the information they believe they have. The tragedy lies in the gap between promise and delivery, between what the map suggests should happen and what the path actually does. That gap is rarely dramatic enough to trigger immediate alarm, but it is wide enough to swallow people whole. As the story moves forward, attention shifts to what happens after maps and paths have both lost authority. When external guidance fades and the hiker must rely on internal judgment alone. That transition marks a turning point, where uncertainty deepens and options narrow, often without anyone realizing how far things have drifted. There is a particular stillness that shows up again and again in these cases, a calm that exists not at the end of the story, but just before it quietly slips out of view. It is unsettling precisely because it does not feel like danger. It feels like nothing at all. The situation has not yet crossed the internal threshold where alarm overrides routine. The woods are unchanged, the air is steady, movement continues, and somewhere within that calm the conditions for disappearance finish assembling themselves. This calm is not the absence of confusion. Confusion may already be present, but it is muted. It does not shout. It does not demand immediate action. It presents itself as mild uncertainty, easily tolerated. People are very good at tolerating uncertainty when nothing appears urgent. In fact, the brain prefers it. Admitting that something is wrong requires energy, attention, and a willingness to interrupt momentum. Calm allows momentum to continue. In the Ozarks, this calm blends seamlessly into the environment. The forests do not change tone when a person becomes slightly disoriented. There is no audible shift, no visible warning. Light filters through trees the same way it always has. Birds continue their patterns. Wind moves leaves without concern for human narratives. The environment offers no feedback that something critical is approaching. This is why the moment before disappearance is so difficult to identify afterward. When search teams reconstruct timelines, they look for a point where behaviour changed. Often there isn't one. The missing person did not suddenly run, hide, or panic. They were still walking, still choosing paths, still operating under the assumption that the situation was manageable. Witnesses, when there are any, often describe the missing person as calm, not rushed, not anxious, sometimes even cheerful. Someone steps ahead on a trail, confident they know where they're going. Someone pauses, expecting to be rejoined shortly. That expectation is shared by everyone involved. No one marks the moment as significant. The unsettling part is that this calm is not ignorance, it is interpretation. The person is reading the situation and concluding, reasonably, that there is no immediate threat. The trail may be unclear, but trails often are. The map may be confusing, but maps sometimes lag behind reality. The woods may look different, but seasons change. Each discrepancy has a benign explanation, and the brain selects the explanation that preserves calm. This selection process is not conscious. It happens automatically. Humans are wired to avoid unnecessary stress. When presented with ambiguous information, the mind fills in the least alarming interpretation by default. This works well most of the time. It keeps us functioning. It keeps us moving forward. In disappearance cases, this adaptive mechanism becomes a liability. The calm delays decisive action. It postpones the moment when someone stops, reorients, or turns back. Instead, they keep walking, trusting that clarity will arrive naturally. There is also a social dimension to this calm. When hiking with others, people mirror each other's emotional states. If no one seems worried, no one becomes worried. Even when someone feels a flicker of doubt, they may suppress it to avoid disrupting the group. Suggesting that something is wrong feels disproportionate to the situation as it appears. Silence reinforces this. Without external signals of danger, internal doubts feel exaggerated. You don't want to be the person who overreacts. You assume resolution is just ahead. So you wait. You continue. Calm persists. In solo situations, the calm becomes internalized. There is no one to validate or challenge your interpretation. You talk yourself through uncertainty. You reassure yourself. You recall previous experiences where similar confusion resolved on its own. Memory supports calm because it is filled with examples where nothing went wrong. The Ozarks provide ample material for this reassurance. Many trails wind, double back, and intersect. It is normal to feel briefly unsure. It is normal to walk longer than expected. The landscape does not punish these experiences immediately. This encourages patience rather than correction. Another factor is effort. Turning back feels like wasted energy. You've already walked this far. Going back means retracing steps that feel unnecessary. Continuing forward feels more efficient, even when logic might suggest otherwise. Calm supports this efficiency narrative. Physiologically, calm keeps the body from entering a stress response. Heart rate remains steady. Breathing stays even. Muscles do not tense. This feels good. It feels right. Stress would feel inappropriate. The body aligns with the mind's interpretation and reinforces it. This alignment matters because stress can prompt protective behaviors. Stress leads people to stop, to reassess, to seek help. Calm does the opposite. It encourages continuation. In the context of subtle disorientation, continuation increases risk without increasing awareness. Search and rescue professionals often say that the most dangerous time is not when someone realizes they are lost, but when they are lost and do not yet know it. That state is defined by calm. It is a window where wrong decisions feel reasonable and corrective decisions feel unnecessary. During this window, people may make choices that later appear puzzling. They may leave the main trail to follow a side path. They may cross a stream instead of staying put. They may aim for a landmark that seems familiar but is not what they think. None of these actions feel desperate. They feel practical. The calm also affects communication. A person may decide not to call or text anyone because there is nothing to report yet. They don't want to bother someone with a non-problem. Phones remain in pockets. Batteries drain quietly. The opportunity to share location or seek advice slips away unnoticed. In some cases, this calm persists until daylight fades. Dusk arrives gradually. Shadows lengthen. The forest changes tone subtly, but not abruptly. There is still no clear signal that something has gone wrong. People underestimate how quickly visibility will drop once light truly goes. When concern finally surfaces, it often does so softly. A realization that time has passed, that a landmark should have appeared by now, that the forest feels quieter than expected. This concern does not immediately replace calm, it coexists with it. This coexistence creates hesitation. Should you worry now, or is this still within normal variation? That hesitation costs time, and time in these environments is a resource that drains faster than people realize. The unsettling nature of this calm becomes most apparent in hindsight. Families look back and wonder why no one noticed sooner, why no one turned around earlier, why no call was made. These questions assume that danger was obvious. In reality, it was not. The calm also complicates narratives of heroism or survival. There is no dramatic struggle to point to, no final stand, just a person moving through an environment that did not signal urgency until urgency was no longer useful. In the Ozark Triangle cases, this calm appears repeatedly. It is part of the pattern. People do not vanish in moments of chaos. They vanish in moments of ordinariness. They disappear not because something loud happened, but because nothing loud happened soon enough. This has implications for prevention. Many safety guidelines emphasize what to do when you realize you're lost. Stop, stay put, signal for help. But fewer emphasize recognizing the early signs that precede that realization. The quiet mismatch, the delayed landmark, the trail that feels slightly wrong. The calm before someone is gone is not a failure of intelligence or experience. It is a feature of how humans interpret environments that feel familiar and non-threatening. It is the brain doing what it evolved to do, in a context where that strategy quietly backfires. Understanding this stage helps explain why disappearances can occur without warning. There is no sudden switch from safety to danger. There is a gradual drift from clarity to ambiguity, cushioned by calm. As the story continues, that calm does not last forever. It eventually gives way to recognition, to urgency, to attempts at correction. But by the time that shift occurs, the conditions have changed. Distance has grown. Energy has been spent. Options have narrowed. The calm does not cause disappearance on its own. It creates the space in which disappearance becomes possible. It smooths over friction. It delays resistance. It allows the story to move forward without drawing attention to itself. What follows is not immediate panic, but response. The moment when absence is noticed by others, when waiting becomes concern, when silence becomes something heavier, and when the landscape that felt cooperative moments earlier becomes the setting for a search rather than a walk. The moment a search begins is often described as decisive, but in reality it unfolds hesitantly, shaped by uncertainty rather than urgency at first. No one wants to believe they need a search party. The idea itself feels excessive until it doesn't. Minutes stretch into an hour becomes 2. Someone checks the parking area again. Someone calls a name into the trees and listens for a reply that never arrives. The woods respond with the same neutral quiet they always have. Search efforts in the Ozarks rarely start with sirens or helicopters. They begin with people standing still, listening. That listening is not passive. It is intense. Every rustle is evaluated. Every distant sound is momentarily elevated into hope before settling back into ordinary forest noise. This early phase is defined by restraint. People don't want to escalate too soon. They don't want to assume the worst. By the time official search and rescue teams are notified, a certain threshold has already been crossed. The missing person has exceeded reasonable expectations. They have not returned when they should have. Attempts to contact them have failed. The calm that existed earlier has fractured, but it has not yet been replaced by clarity. Search parties assemble with purpose, but also with gaps. Information is incomplete. Timelines are approximate. Last known locations are based on memory rather than certainty. The first task is not finding the missing person, but reconstructing intention. Where were they likely headed? How experienced were they? What would they have done if confused? This reconstruction is always imperfect. People rarely follow plans exactly. They adapt, they improvise, they change their minds without announcing it. Searchers know this, but they must still start somewhere. They begin at the last place the person was confirmed to be. From there, they fan out, trusting procedure to compensate for uncertainty. Dogs are often among the first specialized tools deployed. Scent tracking dogs and air scent dogs each bring different capabilities. A scent dog follows a specific individual's trail. An air scent dog searches broadly for human presence. Both rely on assumptions that don't always hold in the Ozarks. Scent behaves unpredictably in this terrain. Humidity, temperature, wind, and ground composition all affect how long a trail remains viable. Limestone and rocky ground hold scent differently than soil. Leaf litter absorbs and disperses odour unevenly. Water crossings can disrupt trails entirely. When dogs pick up a scent, there is often a surge of hope. Movement resumes with renewed focus. Handlers follow closely, watching body language, reading subtle shifts that indicate confidence or confusion. But just as often, the scent stops abruptly. Not fading, not wandering, simply ending. This abruptness is one of the most troubling aspects for search teams. Trails usually degrade gradually. They become weaker, they scatter, they fragment. An abrupt end suggests interruption. Something changed suddenly, but what that change was remains unclear. Handlers offer practical explanations. Wind may have shifted. The dog may have reached a surface that doesn't hold scent. The person may have doubled back or crossed water. All of these are plausible. None of them feel satisfying when repeated across multiple cases. Air scent dogs introduce a different kind of silence. They work by detecting human odour carried by air currents. When they find nothing, it suggests either absence or conditions that prevent detection. Again, the explanation could be environmental, but again, repetition makes it harder to dismiss. Search grids expand. Teams move methodically, calling out names at intervals. Voices carry unevenly. Sometimes a shout seems to vanish into the trees. Other times it echoes strangely, making it hard to judge distance or direction. Silence between calls stretches uncomfortably long. Searchers are trained to listen for response, but also for unnatural quiet. Forests have a baseline soundscape. When that soundscape shifts, it can signal disturbance. In some searches, teams report that everything feels the same. No signs of recent movement, no disruption. This lack of disturbance is not neutral. It suggests that whatever happened did not involve frantic movement. There are no broken branches, no trampled undergrowth, no signs of struggle. The forest appears undisturbed, as if no one passed through at all. Helicopters, when deployed, add another layer. Thermal imaging scans for heat signatures. In cooler conditions, a human body should stand out. But dense canopy interferes. Rocks retain heat. Animals produce false positives. Interpreting thermal data requires caution. When helicopters find nothing, the silence deepens. The search has now covered ground that should have revealed something. The absence becomes harder to explain. Teams begin revisiting assumptions. Maybe the person left the area. Maybe the timeline is wrong. Maybe the trail started somewhere else. Volunteers join official teams. Local knowledge enters the picture. People familiar with the land suggest places to check. Old paths, hidden hollows, areas where sound behaves strangely. These suggestions are practical, not mystical. They come from experience. Even so, the search does not resolve. Daylight fades, night operations are limited, safety protocols restrict movement. The forest becomes quieter still. Searchers withdraw temporarily, leaving markers behind to resume in the morning. This pause is one of the hardest moments. It feels like retreat. It feels like failure, even though it is standard procedure. Families wait, they replay conversations, they imagine scenarios. This silence between search efforts fills with speculation. When searches resume, they often repeat ground already covered. This redundancy is intentional. Fatigue affects perception. Different teams notice different things, but repetition also reinforces the sense that the forest is withholding something. In some cases, items are found. A shoe, a backpack, a piece of clothing. These discoveries are ambiguous. They could be dropped intentionally. They could be lost accidentally. They could be placed after the fact. Each possibility leads in a different direction. Finding items without finding the person creates a new kind of silence. The search now has an artifact but no context. The object becomes a focal point. Teams ask whether it was carried there or left behind, whether it suggests movement or stillness. Dogs may react to these items, confirming scent. But again, trails may lead nowhere. The scent circle closes without opening outward. This reinforces the sense of containment, as if the story folded inward instead of extending forward. Searchers often describe a psychological weight that builds over time. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to frustration mixed with respect. The land does not resist aggressively. It simply does not cooperate. It offers no clues. It absorbs effort without yielding answers. The silence between search parties is not just auditory. It is informational. Each pass yields no new data. Each decision is made with diminishing returns. Commanders must decide when to scale back. This decision is agonizing. Ending an active search does not mean giving up. It means acknowledging limits. Resources are finite. Risk to searchers increases over time. But for families, the end of active searching feels like a second disappearance. After searches conclude, the forest returns to normal use. Trails reopen. Hikers pass through areas that were recently grids and command posts. Life resumes without acknowledgement of what is missing. This contrast is jarring. Occasionally remains are found later by chance. A hunter, a hiker, someone wandering off trail. These discoveries reopen questions rather than closing them. Why here? Why now? Why not earlier? Sometimes remains are found in areas that were previously searched. This is particularly difficult to reconcile. Searchers review maps, they check logs, they question their procedures. How could something be missed? There are explanations. Visibility changes with seasons. Leaf cover hides objects. Animals move remains. Human error occurs. All of this is true, but repetition erodes confidence. The silence persists. Dogs, when brought back later, may react differently. Scents reappear or vanish. No pattern holds consistently. The tools that usually bring resolution fail to do so reliably here. This failure does not imply something extraordinary. It implies complexity. Many small variables interacting in ways that defy simple prediction. But emotionally, complexity feels like avoidance, like the truth is slipping through cracks. The silence between search parties is also a silence of narrative. There is no story to tell that makes sense, no clear sequence, no moment to point to and say, this explains it. For searchers, this is deeply unsettling. Their training is built around problem solving. When a problem resists solution, it creates cognitive dissonance. They review procedures repeatedly, looking for mistakes. Often, none are found. The Ozark Triangle cases are particularly heavy in this regard. The same pattern repeats across years. Search teams change, technology improves, procedures evolve, and still the silence remains. This silence shapes the reputation of the region, not through sensational headlines but through quiet accumulation. A story told between professionals, a shared memory of a search that went nowhere. These stories circulate quietly. They also shape behaviour. Some searchers admit they feel a heightened sense of vigilance in certain areas, not fear, but attention, as if the land requires more respect than it appears to demand. The silence between search parties is not empty. It is filled with effort, expertise, and hope that fails to connect to outcome. That gap is what lingers. As the story continues, attention shifts from organised response to the factors that complicate it further. Weather, terrain, time. Each adds another layer to the silence, making it harder to hear what the forest is not saying. Weather is often treated as background, something noted briefly and then forgotten as long as it remains cooperative. In the Ozarks, this assumption holds just long enough to become dangerous. Forecasts suggest stability. Skies look clear. Temperatures feel mild. Nothing about the morning suggests that conditions will matter later in the day. And yet, weather here has a habit of shifting quietly, not with spectacle, but with timing that undermines decision-making at exactly the wrong moment. The Ozark region sits at a crossroads of air masses. Warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico drifts north. Cooler, drier air slides down from the plains. These systems meet without much warning, and when they do, changes can happen quickly. A calm afternoon can give way to storms by evening. A mild breeze can turn sharp. Visibility can collapse without dramatic build-up. For hikers, this volatility often goes unnoticed until it has already altered the situation. Weather apps update infrequently in remote areas. Cell service is unreliable. A forecast checked at home may not reflect conditions unfolding hours later. The expectation of stability lingers longer than it should. In disappearance cases, weather is often dismissed early. Reports note that conditions were good when the person set out. Clear skies, comfortable temperatures, no immediate hazards. This framing is misleading because it freezes weather at the starting point rather than treating it as a dynamic factor that evolves over time. Light rain, for example, rarely feels threatening. It cools the air, it dampens sound, it makes leaves darker and ground softer, but it also erases tracks quickly. Footprints blur, disturbed soil settles, scent disperses unpredictably. What might have been a clear trail an hour earlier becomes unreadable. Rain also changes behaviour. People seek shelter. They adjust routes to avoid slippery slopes. They may move downhill toward perceived cover. These adjustments are logical but can lead away from familiar paths without conscious intent. Fog is another quiet disruptor. In valleys and low-lying areas, fog can form rapidly, especially in the evening or early morning. It does not announce itself loudly. It seeps in. Visibility shrinks gradually, making it difficult to pinpoint when orientation was lost. Fog alters sound perception as well. Voices seem closer or farther than they are. Direction becomes harder to judge. A shout may feel swallowed rather than echoed. This compounds the silence already present in many cases. Temperature shifts matter even when they are not extreme. A drop of 10 degrees can change comfort levels significantly, especially if someone is underprepared. Mild fatigue becomes chilling. Damp clothing accelerates heat loss. What felt manageable earlier becomes draining later. Hypothermia is often misunderstood. It is not exclusive to freezing conditions. It can develop in cool, wet environments where energy expenditure exceeds intake. Early symptoms are subtle. Confusion, poor decision-making, a false sense of calm. These symptoms mirror the psychological states already present in disorientation, making them difficult to recognize. Wind adds another layer. In the Ozarks, wind patterns are shaped by terrain. Gusts funnel through gaps. Calm areas sit next to turbulent ones. Wind shifts can redirect sound and scent, complicating search efforts. A call for help may carry away from listeners. A scent trail may disperse unevenly. Storms, when they arrive, often do so faster than expected. Thunderheads build behind ridges. Rain arrives in sheets rather than drops. Trails turn slick. Creeks swell. Crossings that were trivial hours earlier become risky. Flash flooding is a particular concern. Limestone terrain allows water to move quickly underground, but surface runoff can still rise rapidly in narrow channels, A hiker following a stream may find their route cut off without much warning. In search timelines, weather often appears as a complicating factor rather than a cause. Searches are delayed due to storms, helicopters grounded, dogs less effective. But weather may have played a role earlier, altering the missing person's decisions long before anyone noticed. One recurring detail in Ozark cases is the mismatch between preparation and conditions. People dress for fair weather because fair weather is expected. They do not pack extra layers or rain protection for short hikes. When conditions change, options narrow. Weather also affects time perception. Overcast skies flatten light. Shadows disappear. It becomes harder to judge how late it is. Evening arrives without the usual visual cues. People underestimate how close they are to darkness. Darkness itself is not immediate. It deepens gradually, but once it reaches a certain point, navigation becomes far more difficult. Trails vanish into uniform shadow. Landmarks lose definition. The forest becomes quieter still. At night, temperature drops further. Dew forms. Clothing becomes damp even without rain. Fatigue sets in. Decision-making degrades. All of this can occur without dramatic weather events, simply through normal diurnal cycles. In disappearance cases, weather rarely leaves a signature moment. There is no single storm to point to and say, this is what caused it. Instead, there is accumulation. Small shifts layered on top of confusion, fatigue, and delayed recognition. Search teams are keenly aware of this. They track weather not just during searches but before them. They analyse how conditions may have influenced movement. Did rain push someone downhill? Did heat encourage rest near water? Did cold accelerate exhaustion? Despite this analysis, weather remains an unreliable narrator. It explains some aspects while obscuring others. It justifies delays and erases evidence. It alters terrain in ways that defy reconstruction. Families often struggle with weather as an explanation because it feels impersonal. It does not account for individuality. It does not explain why one person disappears while others do not. Yet weather interacts with personal choices in complex ways. The Ozark Triangle cases show how weather does not need to be extreme to matter. It only needs to be mistimed. A shift that occurs after confidence is set in. A change that arrives before concern. Weather that turns without warning does not announce danger. It quietly changes the rules. It reduces margins. It accelerates consequences. It does all of this without requiring acknowledgement. In this way, weather becomes part of the silence. It does not speak loudly. It does not demand attention. It simply alters conditions until earlier assumptions no longer hold. As the story continues, weather recedes slightly, not because it stops mattering, but because its effects are now embedded in the situation. Confusion deepens, fatigue grows, the landscape becomes less forgiving. And the human element, psychology, physiology, perception, begins to dominate what happens next. The stories usually don't begin the way outsiders expect them to. There are no dramatic openings, no declarations that something strange lives in the woods. Locals rarely frame these stories as warnings meant to scare. They surface instead in quiet moments, after the practical talk is done, when the light is low and conversation slows. Someone mentions a trail. Someone else pauses a little too long before responding. And then, almost reluctantly, a story is offered. In the Ozarks, storytelling has always been a way of passing along information without formal instruction. Before signs, before guidebooks, before standardized trail systems, people learned the land through shared experience. Stories carried knowledge about where water collected, where ground gave way, where sound behaved oddly. These stories were not treated as entertainment. They were treated as memory. When locals talk about disappearances, they rarely use the language of mystery. They don't speculate loudly. They don't rush toward explanations. What they offer instead are observations. This place feels different. That hollow doesn't echo the way it should. People don't linger there without realizing why. These statements are delivered plainly, without embellishment, which often makes them more unsettling than dramatic tales would be. Many locals emphasize that the woods themselves are not hostile. They resist narratives that paint the Ozarks as cursed or malicious. The land is described as old, patient, and indifferent. It does not chase, it does not lure. It simply does not accommodate mistakes in the way gentler places might. After dark, these stories gain weight not because night adds danger, but because it adds context. The absence of daylight removes visual reassurance, shapes flatten, distances collapse, sounds travel differently. When someone tells a story in this setting, it feels less hypothetical. It feels grounded. One recurring theme in local stories is sound, or rather the lack of it. People talk about places where voices don't carry, where a shout feels swallowed, where footsteps seem quieter than they should be. These observations are not framed as supernatural. They are framed as quirks of terrain, learned through experience. Another theme is direction. Locals mention spots where compasses behave oddly, or where people have a tendency to walk in circles without realizing it. Again, these are not described as magical effects. They're attributed to subtle slopes, repeating landmarks, and the way the forest encourages certain movement patterns. There are also stories about time. Not time travel or missing hours in a dramatic sense, but time that feels compressed or stretched. Someone leaves thinking they've been gone half an hour and returns much later than expected. Someone sets out in the afternoon and is surprised by how quickly night arrives. These stories are told matter-of-factly, as reminders rather than mysteries. Importantly, locals distinguish between places that feel safe and places that deserve caution. This distinction is rarely marked on maps. It is learned socially. You are told which hollows to avoid when you're tired, which ridges to leave before dusk, which trails not to follow if weather shifts. These instructions are woven into conversation, not posted. When outsiders disappear, locals often react with a mix of sadness and recognition. Not surprise, recognition. They may say they always wondered when someone would get turned around there, or that the weather changed faster than expected, or that the person likely underestimated how far things spread out once you leave the main path. These reactions can sound cold to those unfamiliar with the culture, but they are not dismissive. They reflect an understanding that the land operates by its own rules, and that ignoring those rules eventually has consequences. Some stories focus on near misses rather than disappearances. Someone who walked until everything looked the same. Someone who followed a creek that vanished into rock. Someone who realized too late that they had been descending instead of looping. These stories often end with small decisions that make the difference. Turning back early, sitting down to rest, waiting instead of pushing on. These near misses are shared more readily than fatal outcomes. They function as informal lessons. They illustrate how easily things could have gone wrong and how narrowly they didn't. There is also an undercurrent of restraint in these stories. Locals rarely speculate beyond what they know. When asked directly about theories, many deflect. They emphasize preparation. They emphasize respect. They emphasize not assuming that familiarity equals safety. This restraint frustrates some outsiders who want clear answers, but it reflects a worldview shaped by long exposure to uncertainty. Not everything needs an explanation. Some things require adaptation rather than understanding. After dark, when these stories are told, there is often a pause afterward. No one rushes to interpret. The silence is part of the exchange. It allows the listener to absorb what was said without forcing meaning onto it. In some stories, specific places are named. A bend in a river, a particular ridge, a hollow that holds fog longer than it should. These names carry weight locally, but are rarely shared publicly. Naming a place feels like claiming authority over it, and locals tend to avoid that. Instead, directions are given relationally. Near the old fence line, past where the trail narrows, before the second creek crossing. These references assume familiarity, reinforcing the idea that the land must be known through experience, not abstraction. There is also a clear boundary in these stories between respect and fear. Locals do not express fear of the woods, they express awareness. Fear implies unpredictability. Awareness implies pattern. The stories are meant to cultivate the latter. When people disappear, locals often wait before speaking publicly. They allow search efforts to proceed. They avoid adding noise. Afterward, when the immediate urgency has passed, stories resurface quietly, connecting the disappearance to older observations. These connections are not claims of cause, they are acknowledgements of similarity. This happened near the same kind of terrain. The weather behaved similarly. The trail layout matches another incident. Over time, these parallels accumulate. Outsiders sometimes interpret this as superstition. Locals see it as pattern recognition. The difference lies in how certainty is treated. Superstition insists. Local stories suggest. There are also stories about behaviour, about people who push too far because they don't want to admit uncertainty, about visitors who ignore advice because the woods look gentle, about confidence that outpaces preparation. These stories are often told with a hint of frustration rather than judgment. After dark, these stories serve another function. They remind listeners that daylight is finite, that decisions made earlier matter later, that the woods do not change their behaviour to match human expectations. The tone of these stories is important. They are not warnings meant to scare people away. They are calibrations. They adjust how people think about risk without amplifying it unnecessarily. In the context of disappearances, these stories add a layer that official reports lack. They provide texture. They explain why certain areas feel quietly avoided without signage. They reveal knowledge that is situational rather than documented. But they also resist resolution. Locals do not claim that stories explain everything. They accept that some disappearances remain unexplained. The stories exist alongside that uncertainty, not in place of it. This coexistence is key. It shows that understanding does not require closure. It requires attention. It requires listening. It requires accepting that not all information comes in forms that can be logged or verified. As night deepens and these stories settle, they do not demand belief. They invite consideration. They ask listeners to hold the idea that the land is more complex than it appears, without insisting on why. And as the narrative continues, these local perspectives form a quiet backdrop. They don't solve the mystery, they contextualize it. They remind us that long before disappearances were mapped or discussed online, people were already noticing where things felt slightly off and adjusting their behaviour accordingly. From here, the focus shifts away from stories and toward the physical features that underpin many of them. The ground itself, the spaces beneath it, the places where solid earth gives way without much notice, and where absence can become literal rather than symbolic. The Ozarks are not just a surface landscape. What you see when you walk through the woods is only part of what exists there. Beneath the trees, beneath the soil, beneath the trails that feel stable underfoot, there is another geography entirely, one that does not announce itself, and does not care whether anyone is paying attention. This hidden world is made of limestone, water, time, and absence, and it plays a quiet but persistent role in many of the disappearances tied to this region. Limestone is patient stone. It dissolves slowly, almost politely, when water moves across it year after year. Rainwater absorbs carbon dioxide from the air and soil, becoming slightly acidic. Over thousands of years, that weak acid eats away at the rock, widening fractures, hollowing chambers, and creating networks that can stretch for miles without ever revealing themselves on the surface. The Ozarks sit on one of the most cave-dense regions in North America. Thousands of caves are documented, many more are not. What makes this dangerous is not the dramatic caves that attract explorers, the ones with known entrances and names. It is the smaller features, the crevices hidden by leaves, the sinkholes that appear shallow until they are not, the fissures masked by vegetation, where the ground looks solid but isn't. These features don't gape open like mouths, they wait. For hikers, the ground is assumed to be reliable. Trails feel firm. Soil looks undisturbed. Leaves form a continuous carpet that hides subtle changes in elevation. A person can step off trail briefly to avoid an obstacle or investigate something interesting without ever considering what lies beneath their feet. Most of the time, that assumption is correct, but not always. Sinkholes in the Ozarks can be small at the surface and wide below, shaped like inverted funnels. They form gradually, collapsing inward as the limestone dissolves. Some are obvious. Others are disguised by debris, leaves, or fallen branches. From above, they may look like shallow depressions rather than openings. A misstep into one of these features does not necessarily produce dramatic sound. Leaves cushion impact. Soft soil absorbs movement. A person may slide rather than fall, disappearing downward without the sharp noise people expect. If the opening narrows quickly, sound may not escape upward effectively. Crevices between rocks pose a similar risk. Limestone outcrops fracture naturally, creating narrow gaps that widen unpredictably below the surface. These gaps are often vertical or angled, making self-rescue difficult without equipment. A person slipping into one may become wedged, unable to move or call out effectively. Caves themselves introduce complexity. Known cave entrances are usually marked or fenced, but smaller openings are not. Some caves begin as low openings hidden behind brush or at the base of slopes. Others are accessed through vertical drops concealed by vegetation. These entrances do not advertise themselves as hazards. Inside caves, sound behaves differently. Voices do not carry upward well. Shouts may echo deeper into the system rather than out toward the surface. A person trapped inside may be audible to no one above ground, even at close range. Caves also maintain stable temperatures, often cooler than the surface in summer and warmer in winter. This can delay physiological responses. Someone who falls into a cave may not experience immediate hypothermia or heat stress, allowing them to remain conscious for longer periods without being detected. From a search perspective, subterranean spaces are difficult to assess. Ground searches focus on surface clues. A person who disappears into the ground leaves little behind. Footprints may lead to an area that looks undisturbed beyond it. Dogs may lose scent where air circulation changes, or where scent drops vertically rather than dispersing horizontally. There are documented cases in which remains were later found in caves that had been searched superficially but not thoroughly explored. This is not always due to negligence. Cave systems are dangerous for rescuers. Entering unknown spaces carries risk. Decisions must balance the safety of searchers with the possibility of finding someone. The sheer number of caves complicates matters further. Even in areas where caves are known, maps are incomplete. New openings appear after heavy rain or erosion. Old entrances collapse or become blocked. The underground landscape is dynamic in ways that are difficult to monitor. In disappearance cases, caves are often considered but rarely confirmed as causes. This uncertainty fuels speculation. Did the person fall into an unseen opening? Did they seek shelter and become trapped? Did they intentionally enter a cave, unaware of the risk? Each possibility fits some cases and not others. What makes caves particularly unsettling is how quietly they can remove someone from the surface world. There is no struggle visible above ground, no sign of violence, just a transition from one space to another that leaves little trace. Local knowledge again becomes relevant here. Many residents know where caves are, even if they are not marked. They avoid certain areas instinctively. They warn children not to play in specific hollows. These warnings are practical, not mystical. Visitors, however, may not recognize the signs. A shallow depression may look like a comfortable place to rest. A cluster of rocks may seem stable. Without experience, it is difficult to read the ground accurately. The Ozark forests exacerbate this by masking features seasonally. In autumn, leaves fill depressions. In spring, growth obscures openings. In summer, dense foliage hides rock formations entirely. The landscape changes appearance without changing structure. Caves also intersect with water in ways that complicate search efforts. Streams may disappear underground, carrying scent and debris with them. A person following water may unknowingly enter an area where surface clues vanish abruptly. In some cases, personal items have been found near cave entrances: a hat, a shoe. These findings raise difficult questions. Were these items dropped accidentally? Were they removed intentionally? Were they displaced by water or animals? Without context, objects become symbols rather than evidence. The ground that opens quietly does not announce danger. It does not require malice or intent. It simply exists as a result of geological processes indifferent to human movement. That indifference is what makes it difficult to integrate into narratives of disappearance. People prefer stories with agency. Someone made a choice. Something acted upon them. Caves offer neither clearly. They are passive hazards. They do not chase or trap deliberately. They simply provide a space where a misstep can remove someone from view. This passivity also explains why cave-related disappearances feel incomplete. There is no antagonist, no clear mistake, just a quiet transition that feels disproportionate to the outcome. It is important to note that not all disappearances can be explained this way. Many cases do not involve terrain conducive to cave falls. Others involve distances that make this explanation unlikely. But the presence of subterranean complexity adds uncertainty to every search. Search teams must decide where to allocate limited resources. Thoroughly investigating caves requires specialized training and equipment. It also carries risk. These decisions are made under pressure, with incomplete information. Families, understandably, fixate on caves as possibilities. They represent a place where someone could be hidden rather than gone. That hope can persist long after searches end. There is also a psychological dimension to caves. Humans have a deep-seated unease about enclosed spaces and darkness. This unease amplifies speculation. The idea of someone trapped underground is emotionally powerful, even when evidence is lacking. Locals tend to be more restrained in this regard. They know caves are part of the land, not anomalies. They respect them without dramatizing them. This difference in perspective often creates tension between outside narratives and local understanding. The Ozark Triangle cases sit at this intersection, between surface assumptions and subterranean reality, between what looks safe and what is not, between movement and disappearance. The ground that opens quietly is not a singular explanation. It is a contributing factor that complicates every other explanation. It adds a layer of uncertainty that cannot be resolved easily. As the story continues, attention begins to shift away from physical features alone and toward perception. How people experience time, space, and orientation when familiar cues break down. The ground may open quietly, but so can the mind, in ways that alter behavior without announcing themselves clearly. From here, the focus moves upward again, away from what lies beneath the feet and toward what happens inside the head when environments stop behaving as expected. There is a moment people often struggle to describe after spending long stretches in the forest, especially when something has gone wrong. They don't say time stopped. They don't say time sped up dramatically. What they say instead is that time felt strange, slightly off, as if the clock they were used to relying on had slipped out of alignment without making a sound. This sensation is not rare, and it is not mystical. It is a natural consequence of how human perception works when familiar reference points disappear. In the Ozarks, this effect can be subtle enough that people don't notice it until afterward, when they try to reconstruct events and realize that their sense of duration no longer matches reality. Modern life is saturated with time cues. Clocks glow on screens, notifications arrive on schedules, artificial lighting keeps days and nights predictable. Even when we're not consciously checking the time, our environment constantly reminds us of it. In the forest, especially away from roads and buildings, those reminders fade quickly. The sun becomes the primary clock. but it is an imprecise one when filtered through trees and terrain. Light does not change evenly. Shadows stretch in complex patterns. Hills block early sunsets. Valleys hold brightness longer than expected. A person may believe there is plenty of daylight left when, in fact, the window is closing faster than they realize. This distortion matters because it affects decision-making. People base choices on how much time they believe they have, whether to turn back, whether to push forward, whether to rest now or later. When time feels abundant, caution decreases. When it feels scarce, panic can increase. In the forest, time often feels abundant longer than it should. In disappearance cases, this leads to a common mismatch. A person intends a short hike. They believe they are only slightly behind schedule. They assume they can correct course easily, but their internal clock has drifted. What feels like an hour may be several. What feels like a brief detour may have doubled their distance from safety. Fatigue amplifies this effect. As energy drops, the brain's ability to track time accurately declines. Effort feels heavier, movement slows, but subjective time does not always slow with it. People may feel like they are making steady progress when, objectively, they are not. The forest environment contributes to this miscalibration. Repetition of visual elements makes it harder to judge distance travelled. Trees look similar. Slopes feel familiar. Without clear landmarks, the brain struggles to mark progress. This makes time feel compressed because fewer distinct memories are being formed. Memory plays a critical role here. Time perception is closely tied to how many events the brain records. In environments with novelty, time feels longer in retrospect because there are more memories. In repetitive environments, time feels shorter because memories blur together. The Ozark forests with their repeating patterns encourage this blurring. This means that someone may walk for hours but later remember it as much less. When searchers ask how long the person might have been gone before being noticed, estimates are often too low. This underestimation delays response and expands search areas beyond initial expectations. Stress also distorts time, but not always in predictable ways. In acute emergencies, time can feel slowed. In low-grade uncertainty, time can feel suspended. A person who is mildly confused but not yet panicked may feel like they're moving through a prolonged present, where minutes and hours lose distinction. This prolonged present reinforces inaction. When time does not feel like it is advancing meaningfully, urgency does not arise. A person may sit down to rest, believing they have plenty of daylight left. They may continue exploring, assuming resolution is close. Meanwhile, the objective clock continues without regard for perception. Another factor is the absence of scheduled interruptions. In daily life, time is segmented by obligations. Meetings start, meals occur, transitions happen. In the forest, there are no built-in breaks unless you create them. Without these anchors, time becomes continuous rather than segmented. This continuity feels calming at first. It allows people to relax, but it also removes the sense of pacing that helps regulate behaviour. People lose track of how long they have been exerting themselves. They overestimate their remaining energy. They underestimate the consequences of delay. In disappearance cases, this often shows up in the form of late realization. Someone notices that it is darker than expected, that hunger has set in, that fatigue feels disproportionate. These realizations arrive all at once, creating a sudden sense of time loss rather than gradual awareness. By the time this awareness arrives, options have narrowed. Turning back may take longer than expected. Navigation may be harder in low light. Temperature may be dropping. The window for easy correction has closed quietly. There is also the phenomenon of temporal looping, where people revisit the same area multiple times without realizing it. Without clear landmarks, someone may circle back unknowingly. Each pass feels like forward movement because the environment looks consistent. Time passes without progress. This looping is particularly dangerous because it creates false reassurance. You believe you are covering new ground. In reality, you're expending energy without reducing distance to safety. When search teams later find tracks that overlap, they often infer confusion rather than panic. The Ozarks, with their rolling terrain and dense tree cover, are well suited to this kind of disorientation. Hills block long sight lines, valleys curve paths gently. It is easy to drift off course without sharp directional cues. Time perception is also influenced by expectation. If you expect a hike to take 2 hours, your brain calibrates accordingly. Deviations are interpreted relative to that expectation rather than absolute time. If things take longer, you assume minor delays rather than fundamental errors. This expectation bias persists until contradicted strongly enough to override it. In familiar woods, contradiction is slow to arrive. The forest does not escalate cues quickly. It allows expectation to persist longer than it should. Physiological states compound this. Dehydration affects cognitive function early, often before thirst is intense. Blood sugar drops impair judgment. These changes subtly alter time perception, making people feel less urgency and more fatigue simultaneously. Hypoglycemia, for example, can create a sense of mental fog where time feels both slow and unimportant. Decisions feel harder. Motivation drops. A person may choose to rest rather than act, believing they will recover quickly. Sleep deprivation, if someone began the hike already tired, further degrades temporal awareness. The brain relies on internal rhythms to track time. When those rhythms are disrupted, accuracy suffers. The forest environment does not correct these errors. There are no clocks to check. Phones may be dead or unused. The only feedback comes from the body, and those signals are often misinterpreted. In search narratives, this leads to gaps. People cannot account for hours, not because they were unconscious or transported elsewhere, but because their internal record is incomplete. They remember starting. They remember certain points. The rest blurs. Families sometimes struggle with this aspect. They want clear timelines. When timelines are vague, it feels evasive. In reality, it reflects how memory encodes experience under these conditions. Time that feels slightly off is not dramatic enough to attract attention. It does not trigger alarm bells. It simply shifts perception enough to undermine decision-making gradually. This shift also affects how people interpret sound and movement. When time feels distorted, cause and effect feel less immediate. A delay in response does not feel urgent. Silence does not feel threatening yet. In the context of disappearances, this temporal distortion helps explain why people do not act when, in hindsight, they should have. They did not experience the situation as urgent. They experienced it as unresolved but manageable. Search teams often note that missing persons likely believed they were close to solving their situation. They did not perceive themselves as running out of time. This belief persists until evidence overwhelms it. Once time reasserts itself forcefully, it does so abruptly. Darkness falls, temperature drops, fatigue peaks. At that point the situation changes character. Calm gives way to urgency, but urgency arrives late. This lateness is critical. It transforms manageable problems into dangerous ones. Navigation that was possible in daylight becomes risky in darkness. Trails that were ambiguous become invisible. Landmarks vanish. The forest does not change. Perception does. Time, which felt suspended, suddenly accelerates. Minutes feel precious. Decisions feel heavy. Stress spikes. In many cases, this is when people make last-ditch efforts to correct course. They may push harder, move faster, take risks they would have avoided earlier. These efforts consume remaining energy quickly. Time distortion thus operates in 2 phases. First, it delays recognition. Then it compresses response. Both phases increase risk. Understanding this helps demystify aspects of the Ozark Triangle disappearances that otherwise seem inexplicable. People did not lose hours mysteriously. Their perception drifted gradually, and memory failed to capture that drift clearly. This is not a personal failing. It is a human one. Our brains evolved to track time using environmental cues that forests obscure. When those cues disappear, our internal clocks become unreliable. The forest does not deceive deliberately. It simply does not provide the information our minds rely on. Time becomes something we feel rather than measure, and feeling is not precise. As the narrative continues, this altered sense of time intersects with something even more influential: how the mind responds to uncertainty itself. When time, space, and expectation all begin to loosen, psychology takes the lead, and the decisions made in that state often determine whether someone finds their way back or moves further into the unknown. Getting lost is often imagined as a sudden realization, a moment when someone stops, looks around, and understands immediately that something has gone wrong. In reality, that moment is rare. More often, people become lost gradually, without ever labeling the experience as being lost. By the time the word applies, the situation has already been unfolding for longer than they realize. Psychologists sometimes describe this state as unrecognized disorientation. It occurs when a person's internal model of where they are no longer matches reality, but the mismatch is not strong enough to trigger alarm. The brain continues operating under assumptions that are slightly wrong, adjusting just enough to maintain coherence without correcting course. This process is deeply human. The brain is not designed to question itself constantly. It is designed to maintain continuity. When faced with ambiguous information, it prefers explanations that preserve the current narrative rather than disrupt it. In the forest, this means interpreting uncertainty as normal variation rather than error. When a trail bends unexpectedly, the mind does not think, "I am lost." It thinks, "The trail curves here." When a landmark fails to appear, the mind does not think, "My map is wrong" or "I am off course." It thinks, "I must be misremembering." Each thought maintains confidence just long enough to prevent recalibration. This is reinforced by confirmation bias. People unconsciously seek information that supports their current belief and discount information that contradicts it. If you believe you're heading toward a familiar point, every tree that looks familiar becomes evidence. Every unfamiliar feature is dismissed as insignificant. In the Ozarks, where environments repeat visually, this bias is particularly powerful. Forests do not offer clear contradictions, they offer sameness. That sameness allows mistaken assumptions to survive far longer than they would in more varied terrain. Another psychological factor is goal fixation. When someone sets out with a destination in mind, their attention narrows around reaching it. Deviations are interpreted as temporary obstacles rather than indicators of error. You assume the path will straighten out because you expect it to. Goal fixation reduces exploratory behavior. Instead of stopping to reassess broadly, people push forward, scanning only for cues that confirm they are still progressing toward the goal. This works well when navigation is accurate. It fails quietly when it is not. There is also the sunk cost effect. The farther someone walks, the more invested they become in their chosen direction. Turning back feels like wasting effort. Even when doubt arises, people tend to continue, because they have already committed time and energy to the path they are on. This effect is subtle at first. It does not feel like stubbornness, it feels like efficiency. Why go back when you're surely almost there? Each additional step increases commitment and decreases willingness to reverse course. Social psychology plays a role as well, even for solo hikers. Humans internalize social expectations. We imagine how our actions would appear to others. Turning back early may feel like admitting competence, even if no one is watching. This imagined judgment can influence behavior unconsciously. In group settings, this effect multiplies. No one wants to be the first to say something is wrong. Doubt is contagious, but so is confidence. If the group appears calm, individuals suppress their own uncertainty. This can delay corrective action until the situation is more serious. Another important concept is attentional tunneling. When people are mildly stressed or focused, their attention narrows. Peripheral cues are missed. This is not panic, it is concentration. In the forest, attentional tunneling can cause people to miss trail markers, subtle changes in terrain, or auditory cues that might otherwise prompt reassessment. Fatigue worsens this. As physical energy drops, cognitive flexibility declines. The brain becomes less capable of holding multiple possibilities in mind. People default to the simplest interpretation. Usually that interpretation is that nothing is wrong. Dehydration and low blood sugar amplify these effects. They impair executive function, which is responsible for planning, inhibition, and error correction. Under these conditions, people persist in familiar patterns even when those patterns are failing. This persistence is not reckless, it is automatic. The brain conserves resources by sticking with known strategies. In unfamiliar environments, this can be adaptive. In subtly changing environments, it can be dangerous. Another psychological factor is narrative continuity. Humans experience life as a story. We expect events to unfold logically. Getting lost disrupts that narrative. It introduces chaos. The brain resists this disruption by bending perception to preserve the story. As long as the story feels intact, urgency does not arise. You're still on a hike. You're still moving forward. Nothing has forced a plot change. The brain prefers to delay acknowledging a narrative break. In many disappearance cases, this narrative continuity persists until an external factor forces recognition. Darkness, severe fatigue, injury. By then, the situation has changed qualitatively. Options have narrowed. There is also the phenomenon of overconfidence born from experience. Experienced hikers often trust their intuition more than novices. This intuition is usually reliable, but it can fail in environments where cues are misleading. When intuition conflicts with objective information, experienced individuals may favour intuition. This is not arrogance, it is learning. Intuition is built from past success, but when conditions differ subtly from those past experiences, intuition can lead people astray without triggering self-doubt. Memory also distorts perception of direction. People tend to remember routes as straighter and simpler than they were. This leads to errors when attempting to backtrack. A turn you barely noticed earlier becomes hard to locate later. When backtracking fails, confidence erodes. But even then, people may not label themselves as lost. They may think they have simply overshot a turn. This keeps the problem framed as local rather than global. Another factor is optimism bias. People generally believe they will be fine. They expect positive outcomes. This bias keeps anxiety low and motivation high in normal situations. In disorientation, it delays protective behaviours. Optimism bias is reinforced by the environment. The Ozarks do not look threatening. There are no visual cues that suggest imminent danger. The land feels accommodating. This supports the belief that resolution is near. There is also the illusion of control. People believe they can fix the situation if needed. This belief reduces urgency. You don't signal for help because you believe you can still solve the problem yourself. This illusion persists longer in environments where movement is easy. If the terrain were impassable, control would feel limited. In the Ozarks, movement remains possible almost everywhere. This creates the sense that you are still in charge. Psychologists also note that people are poor at recognizing gradual change. Sudden change captures attention. Gradual change blends into baseline. Getting lost is usually gradual. The brain adjusts incrementally, failing to notice when cumulative change becomes significant. This is why people often say, later, that they don't know when things went wrong. There was no single moment, just a series of small adjustments that never triggered alarm. Once recognition finally occurs, the psychological state shifts abruptly. Calm gives way to stress. Stress narrows attention further. Decision-making becomes reactive. People may rush, overcorrect, or freeze. Ironically, this late-stage stress can be more dangerous than earlier calm. It consumes energy quickly. It leads to riskier choices. It disrupts memory formation. making later reconstruction even harder. Search teams often infer psychological states from movement patterns. Erratic paths suggest panic. Smooth but incorrect paths suggest unrecognized disorientation. Many Ozark cases show the latter. This pattern explains why disappearances can occur without signs of struggle or distress. The person did not experience the situation as dangerous until it was too late to respond effectively. It also explains why some missing persons are found surprisingly far from expected locations. They continued moving with confidence, covering ground efficiently while being wrong about direction. The psychology of getting lost without knowing it challenges common assumptions about safety. It shows that danger does not always announce itself through fear. It can arrive through comfort. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect. People disappear not because they ignored obvious threats, but because their minds protected them from perceiving threat too soon. Understanding this does not solve the mystery of the Ozark Triangle. It does not explain every case, but it reframes them. It shifts focus from dramatic events to ordinary cognition operating in the wrong context. As the story continues, this psychological drift intersects with patterns that emerge across cases. Similar behaviors, similar timelines, similar outcomes. When individual psychology aligns with environmental features, patterns form, and those patterns are what draw investigators, researchers, and listeners deeper into the question of why some people vanish while others walking the same trails do not. When individual disappearances are viewed in isolation, they feel chaotic. Each case has its own context, its own variables, its own unanswered questions. Different ages, different experience levels, different weather conditions, different trails. On the surface, there is no obvious thread that ties them together. And yet, when cases are laid side by side and examined patiently, certain patterns begin to surface. Not patterns that explain everything, but patterns that repeat often enough to feel deliberate, even if their cause remains unclear. These patterns are unsettling precisely because they do not announce themselves. They are not dramatic signatures. They are absences where something expected should be. Silence where noise would make sense, order where chaos might be assumed, the familiar shapes of human behavior unfolding in ways that lead to unfamiliar endings. One of the most consistent patterns is the lack of struggle. In many Ozark Triangle cases, there are no signs that the missing person fought against their environment or another force. No torn clothing, no broken branches indicating frantic movement, no disturbed ground suggesting panic. Instead, the terrain looks largely untouched, as if the person moved through it calmly, deliberately, and then simply stopped being traceable. This absence of struggle challenges instinctive assumptions. People expect danger to provoke resistance. They expect fear to leave marks. But again and again, those marks are missing. This suggests that the disappearance was not experienced as a crisis at the moment it unfolded. Another recurring pattern is proximity. Many disappearances occur closer to trails, camps, or known landmarks than expected. People imagine that missing hikers wander deep into remote wilderness. In reality, some vanish within a surprisingly small radius of familiar areas, sometimes within a few hundred yards, sometimes within sight of paths others are using. This proximity complicates search efforts because it contradicts intuitive search logic. Teams initially focus on expanding outward, assuming distance. When the missing person is actually nearby but obscured by terrain, vegetation, or vertical features, searchers can pass over critical areas without detecting anything. There is also a recurring pattern of partial evidence. Items are found without context. A shoe located without a body. A backpack resting upright. Clothing discovered folded or placed rather than scattered. These details resist straightforward interpretation. Objects left behind suggest intentionality, but not necessarily distress. They imply a decision, but not the reasoning behind it. Families often struggle with this most. The presence of belongings without explanation creates a painful limbo between hope and loss. Searchers caution against overinterpreting these findings. There are many reasons items can be separated from people: fatigue, injury, practical decisions made under stress, environmental displacement. Still, the repetition of these scenarios across unrelated cases is difficult to ignore. Another familiar pattern is timing. Disappearances frequently occur during transitions, late afternoon, early evening, times when light is changing but not yet gone. When people believe they have enough time to adjust but the margin is narrower than they realise. This timing aligns with psychological factors already discussed. Perceived abundance of time delays corrective action. When daylight finally fades, it does so quickly. Recognition arrives late. Seasonality also appears as a pattern. Many cases cluster in spring and fall. These are seasons when weather is variable, foliage changes visibility, and temperatures fluctuate. Trails look different. Landmarks shift. Expectations based on previous visits may no longer apply. In spring, growth obscures features that were visible months earlier. In fall, leaves cover ground irregularities and trail edges. In both seasons, the forest looks familiar enough to invite confidence, but altered enough to undermine navigation. Another pattern involves experience level. Disappearances include both novices and seasoned outdoors people. This challenges the assumption that inexperience is the primary risk factor. In fact, experienced individuals may be more vulnerable to certain errors due to over-reliance on intuition and memory. Experienced hikers often feel comfortable improvising. They take shortcuts. They explore side paths. They rely on internal maps built from past success. When conditions differ subtly, these strategies can fail without triggering self-doubt. There is also a pattern in how people are last seen. Many are described as moving ahead confidently, not lagging, not struggling. Someone walks a bit faster. Someone steps forward to check something. The separation feels minor. It is treated as temporary. This pattern reinforces the idea that disappearance does not begin with vulnerability. It begins with confidence. The person who goes missing is often the one who appears most capable at that moment. Search records also reveal patterns in how cases end or fail to. Some remain unresolved indefinitely. Others are resolved years later by chance. Remains are discovered in areas that were previously searched or thought unlikely. These delayed discoveries create frustration and doubt. They raise questions about search effectiveness, but they also reflect how environments change over time. Visibility improves when foliage drops, water recedes, animal activity shifts. What was invisible before becomes visible later. Importantly, these discoveries rarely clarify the full sequence of events. They provide location without narrative. They tell us where someone ended up, not how or why. Another pattern is the absence of witnesses. Even in popular areas, people disappear without anyone seeing or hearing the critical moment. This speaks to how fragmented human presence can be in forests. Two groups can be close without intersecting. Sightlines are limited. Sound travels unevenly. This fragmentation allows events to unfold privately, even in shared spaces. The illusion of safety created by others nearby does not always translate into actual observation. There is also a pattern in official explanations. Many cases are classified as accidents, exposure, or unknown. These categories are broad. They acknowledge outcome without specifying cause. This reflects the limits of available evidence rather than certainty. Public narratives often push for singular explanations. One cause, one theory, one answer. The patterns observed in Ozark Triangle cases resist this simplification. They suggest convergence rather than uniformity. Different factors align in similar ways across cases. Subtle disorientation, delayed recognition, environmental complexity, psychological biases. Each factor alone is manageable. Together they create situations that exceed individual coping strategies. This convergence is what creates the appearance of pattern, not a single hidden force, but a repeatable alignment of conditions that quietly overwhelms people without dramatic escalation. Researchers who study missing persons emphasize this point. Patterns do not imply inevitability, they imply probability. Certain conditions increase risk. Certain behaviours amplify that risk. The Ozarks provide an environment where these conditions align more frequently than expected. This does not mean the region is uniquely dangerous. It means it is uniquely misleading. It looks easier than it is. It feels forgiving when it is not. Another familiar pattern is how stories evolve after disappearances. Early reports focus on facts. Later narratives fill gaps with speculation. Over time, details blur. Patterns become exaggerated. This complicates analysis. Serious researchers work against this drift. They cross-reference sources. They verify timelines. They strip stories back to what can be confirmed. Even then, the patterns remain. Families often notice patterns independently. They connect with other families. They share experiences, similar frustrations, similar unanswered questions. This communal recognition can be validating but also painful. It reinforces the sense that their case is not isolated, but it also highlights how little resolution others have found. Hope and despair coexist uneasily. There is also a pattern in public reaction. Interest spikes after a disappearance. Then it fades. Attention moves on. For families, the story never ends. For the public, it often does. This fading attention contributes to the sense of unresolved pattern. Cases accumulate without closure. The triangle becomes a shorthand for that accumulation rather than a defined phenomenon. Some critics argue that focusing on patterns risks obscuring individual accountability or specific causes. They worry that clustering cases creates an illusion of a mystery where none exists. This concern is valid and deserves respect. However, acknowledging patterns does not negate individual explanations. It contextualizes them. It allows us to ask why certain explanations recur in certain environments. The Ozark Triangle is less about a place and more about a process where human psychology, environmental subtlety, and delayed recognition intersect repeatedly. Understanding these familiar patterns does not make disappearances less tragic. It makes them more comprehensible without making them less painful. It also shifts the question. Instead of asking why hikers disappear here, we begin asking under what conditions disappearances become likely anywhere, and why this region meets those conditions so often. This shift matters because it opens the door to prevention rather than myth. It suggests that risk can be reduced by addressing patterns rather than chasing singular causes. As the story moves forward, attention turns toward explanations that try to account for these patterns explicitly. Some stay grounded in practical reasoning. Others stretch further, testing the boundaries of what feels reasonable. These explanations do not replace the patterns. They attempt to sit on top of them, to explain them, to organize them into something coherent. Whether they succeed is another question. When faced with a collection of vanishings that refuse to resolve cleanly, the mind reaches first for explanations that feel solid. Explanations that are grounded, testable, and familiar. In the case of the Ozark Triangle, there is no shortage of rational theories. In fact, there are many that seem convincing at first glance. They explain parts of the pattern. They account for certain outcomes. They offer comfort by restoring cause and effect. And yet, when each is followed to its limits, something remains unresolved. Not wrong, but incomplete. One of the most frequently cited explanations is simple navigational error leading to exposure. A person gets lost, continues moving, becomes exhausted, and eventually succumbs to the elements. This explanation fits many wilderness fatalities worldwide. It requires no unusual forces, only human limitation interacting with environment. In the Ozarks, exposure does not require extreme cold or heat. Cool nights, damp conditions, and fatigue can combine to produce hypothermia, even in temperatures that appear mild on paper. A person who is tired, underfed, or wet can deteriorate quickly without recognizing the danger. Early hypothermia mimics calm confusion. Judgment declines, movement slows, rest feels appealing. This aligns with many disappearance timelines, but this explanation falters when applied broadly. Exposure usually leaves evidence. Bodies are often found along logical paths of travel. Clothing choices reflect attempts to conserve warmth. Shelters may be improvised. In some Ozark cases, none of this is present. Remains, when found, are sometimes located in places inconsistent with gradual collapse, or are not found at all. Another common explanation involves injury. A slip, a fall, a twisted ankle. The terrain, while not extreme, is uneven. Limestone becomes slick when wet. A minor injury can immobilize someone enough to prevent self-rescue. If that injury occurs off-trail, visibility drops dramatically. This explanation fits well with cases where individuals were alone. It also explains silence. A person who falls awkwardly may be incapacitated before calling out. However, injuries often leave traces: disturbed ground, broken vegetation, blood. These signs are not always present, especially after weather events, but their consistent absence raises questions. Animal encounters are another rational avenue often explored. The Ozarks are home to black bears, coyotes, feral hogs, and smaller predators. While attacks on humans are rare, they are not impossible. An encounter could theoretically result in rapid incapacitation without prolonged struggle, yet evidence does not support this explanation in most cases. Predatory attacks leave distinct signs: drag marks, scattered belongings, trauma patterns. These are largely absent. Additionally, large predators capable of silently removing a person without trace are not common in this region. Human involvement is sometimes suggested, particularly in cases near roads or popular areas. Accidental encounters, criminal acts. These explanations feel uncomfortable but rational. People do harm to each other. It happens everywhere. Law enforcement agencies investigate this possibility seriously. They look for signs of foul play. They examine known offenders. They analyze patterns of opportunity. In the majority of Ozark cases, evidence does not support this explanation. There are no consistent suspects, no overlapping timelines, no forensic indicators. This does not mean human involvement is impossible. It means it does not explain the pattern as a whole. It fits some scenarios and fails others. Medical events offer another rational framework. Heart attacks, strokes, seizures, diabetic emergencies. These can occur suddenly and incapacitate a person before they can seek help. They can explain silence and rapid disappearance. Medical explanations are plausible in individual cases, especially when health history supports them, but they struggle to account for patterns of movement observed before disappearance. They also do not explain why remains are sometimes found far from likely collapse points, or why belongings are separated in odd ways. Environmental hazards beyond caves also enter the discussion. Sinkholes, as already explored, offer a mechanism for sudden disappearance. So do steep ravines, hidden drop-offs, and dense undergrowth that conceals bodies from view. These hazards are real. They explain some outcomes convincingly, but again, they do not apply universally. Many disappearances occur in areas without significant vertical features. Others involve distances inconsistent with a single fall. Another rational explanation involves water, drowning in rivers or creeks, slipping into fast-moving water and being carried away. The Ozarks contain many waterways that change rapidly with rain. Water-related fatalities typically leave downstream evidence. Bodies surface, items wash up. While this happens in some cases, many remain unresolved without water playing a clear role. Then there is the idea of intentional disappearance. Someone chooses to walk away from their life. The forest provides cover. This explanation is often raised quietly and with discomfort. While intentional disappearances do occur, they rarely align with the pattern seen here. Most people who disappear intentionally leave trails of preparation. financial activity, communication, planning. Many Ozark cases involve individuals with no such indicators who vanish during ordinary recreational activities. Psychological breakdowns are also considered: acute psychosis, dissociation, panic-driven flight. Under extreme stress, people can behave unpredictably. They may discard belongings. They may move erratically. This explanation fits some elements, particularly in cases involving sudden stress or intoxication. But many missing individuals showed no prior signs of psychological distress. Their behaviour before disappearance was coherent and purposeful. What becomes apparent when examining these explanations is that each accounts for fragments of the pattern. None account for all of it. Each fits some cases well and others poorly. When forced to cover everything, they stretch beyond credibility. This is where frustration sets in for investigators and researchers. Rational explanations are not wrong. They are incomplete. The difficulty lies in the expectation that there should be one explanation that fits all cases. Reality does not always cooperate with that desire. The Ozark Triangle does not appear to operate through a single mechanism. It operates through convergence, multiple ordinary factors aligning in similar ways across different situations: human cognition, environmental subtlety, terrain complexity, weather variability, delayed recognition. Each factor is unremarkable alone. Together they create conditions where ordinary mistakes lead to extraordinary outcomes. The phrase "almost fit" matters here. Rational explanations come close enough to be tempting, close enough to be repeated, but not close enough to resolve lingering questions. Why do some people vanish so completely while others, making similar mistakes, return safely? Why do search efforts fail repeatedly in certain areas? Why are timelines so difficult to reconstruct? These gaps invite speculation not because people reject rationality, but because rationality feels insufficient on its own. The human mind seeks closure. When it does not arrive, other possibilities begin to surface. It is important to resist the urge to dismiss rational explanations simply because they are incomplete. They remain essential. They ground analysis. They prevent narratives from drifting into unfalsifiable territory. At the same time, acknowledging their limits is honest. It reflects the complexity of real-world events rather than forcing them into tidy frameworks. In many ways, the Ozark Triangle cases highlight the limits of explanation itself. They remind us that not all outcomes are cleanly traceable, even when causes are mundane. This tension sets the stage for what comes next. When rational explanations fail to fully satisfy, attention naturally drifts toward theories that stretch beyond the ordinary, not necessarily because they are more accurate, but because they attempt to account for what remains. As the story continues, those theories emerge not as conclusions, but as reflections of unresolved space, what people imagine when known explanations stop short. When rational explanations begin to fray at the edges, the mind does not stop working. It keeps searching. It widens the frame. It asks whether the assumptions guiding earlier conclusions were too narrow. This is where theories begin to drift beyond the ordinary, not always because they are believed, but because they offer language for what remains unexplained. These theories rarely appear first. They arrive later, after reports have been read, after maps have been studied, after official explanations have been weighed and found lacking in some quiet way. They are not usually spoken aloud in professional settings. They surface in private conversations, online forums, late-night discussions, and the spaces where unresolved questions gather. One of the most common of these ideas involves the concept of spatial disorientation that goes beyond simple getting lost. The suggestion is not that people fail to navigate, but that the environment itself interferes with perception in subtle ways, not through anything dramatic or visible, but through cumulative effects that alter orientation, memory, and awareness. Some point to geological features. The Ozarks are rich in iron deposits and complex rock formations. There are claims, debated and often unverified, that certain areas may affect compasses or interfere with the electronic signals. Even small inconsistencies in navigation tools can undermine confidence and reinforce reliance on intuition, which, as discussed earlier, is not always reliable here. Others expand this idea into something less technical and more experiential. They describe places that feel disorienting without obvious cause, areas where direction seems to lose coherence, where paths feel longer than they should, where people report a sense of being subtly turned around without noticing the moment it happened. These accounts are often dismissed because they rely on subjective experience. But subjective experience is precisely what governs behaviour in uncertain environments. Whether or not the cause is measurable, the effect on decision-making can be real. Another category of theories focuses on altered states of consciousness. Fatigue, dehydration, stress, and sensory monotony can combine to produce dissociative experiences. People may feel detached from their surroundings, time may feel unreal, judgment may be impaired without obvious distress. In these states, behaviour can shift in ways that feel intentional at the time but appear irrational in retrospect. Someone may leave a trail to follow a vague impulse. They may discard items that feel unnecessary or burdensome. They may move toward areas that offer a sense of familiarity, even if those areas increase risk. These explanations remain grounded in psychology and physiology, but they drift toward territory that feels unfamiliar because it challenges the idea of conscious control. They suggest that people can act decisively while being subtly disconnected from accurate perception. Other theories move further outward. Some suggest that certain landscapes produce psychological effects simply by their structure. Repeating patterns, limited horizons, enclosed spaces. These elements can induce trance-like states, especially during prolonged solo activity. This is not a new idea. Similar effects have been documented in deserts, oceans, and polar environments. The mind responds to monotony by turning inward. Attention drifts. Awareness narrows. In the Ozarks, dense forest can create this effect without appearing extreme. From there, some narratives cross into the explicitly speculative. Ideas about dimensional slips, time anomalies, or spaces where reality behaves differently. These theories are often met with skepticism, and rightly so. They lack empirical support. They cannot be tested reliably. Yet they persist, not because they are convincing, but because they attempt to explain something that feels qualitatively different about certain cases. They give shape to discomfort. They name the feeling that something ordinary explanations cannot quite reach. Another recurring speculative theory involves human perception of safety. Some suggest that environments that feel safe may lower vigilance too effectively, creating blind spots that feel unnatural in hindsight. This is less a supernatural idea and more a philosophical one, but it often gets grouped with more dramatic theories because it challenges intuitive understanding. There are also narratives involving human presence that is difficult to trace, not organised crime or overt violence, but chance encounters with individuals living off-grid, engaging in illegal activity or avoiding detection. These ideas surface particularly in discussions of remote regions. While such scenarios are possible, evidence remains scarce. They function more as placeholders for uncertainty than as robust explanations. They acknowledge that not all human activity is visible or documented. It is important to note how these theories are used. Most people who discuss them do not assert them as truth. They use them to explore the boundaries of what feels explainable. They are tools for conversation rather than conclusions. The danger lies in mistaking speculation for resolution. When theories drift too far from evidence, they can obscure practical lessons. They can shift focus away from prevention, preparation, and understanding. At the same time, dismissing all non-ordinary theories outright can feel unsatisfying when rational explanations leave persistent gaps. Humans are not comfortable with unresolved space. We fill it with stories because stories give form to uncertainty. The Ozark Triangle exists largely in this space, between explanation and imagination. between what can be demonstrated and what can only be felt. What is notable is that even the most speculative theories often circle back to the same themes: disorientation, silence, subtle transitions, gradual shifts rather than sudden events. This consistency suggests that, regardless of interpretation, people are responding to similar underlying features. These theories also reflect the emotional weight of disappearance. They are attempts to restore meaning where meaning has been stripped away. When someone vanishes without trace, the absence feels wrong. The mind searches for frameworks that can hold that wrongness. For families, these theories can be both comforting and distressing. Comforting because they imply something more than simple accident. Distressing because they offer no actionable path forward. Professionals tend to avoid these discussions publicly, not because they dismiss them entirely, but because they cannot work with them operationally. Searches require boundaries. Procedures require assumptions. Speculation does not translate into search grids, and yet, privately, many investigators acknowledge the limits of their tools. They recognize when a case resists resolution despite best efforts. In those moments, speculation can creep in, not as belief, but as acknowledgement of uncertainty. Theories that drift beyond the ordinary tell us less about what happened and more about what remains unresolved. They map the edges of understanding rather than the center. They also reveal something about us, about our discomfort with silence, about our need to believe that every outcome has a cause we can name. As this narrative moves forward, the focus begins to narrow again, away from speculation and back toward the land itself. Not the dramatic features, but the quiet persistence of the Ozarks, how it absorbs stories, how it keeps secrets without effort. What remains is not a theory, but a question. Not what happened in any single case, but why the region continues to produce disappearances that resist closure. And that question leads us toward the final movements of this story, where the emphasis shifts from explanation to acceptance, from solving to understanding why some landscapes do not yield answers easily, and why we continue to walk into them anyway. The Ozarks do not keep secrets in the way people usually imagine. There is no intention behind it, no effort to hide. The land does not conceal out of malice or mystery. It keeps secrets because it does not organize itself around human understanding. What feels like withholding is often just indifference layered over complexity, repeated long enough to look deliberate. This region has been shaped slowly, over spans of time that make human timelines feel insignificant. Water carved the stone without urgency. Forests grew, burned, regrew. Valleys formed not to guide movement, but to channel runoff. None of these processes cared whether paths made sense to people walking them centuries later. The result is a landscape that works perfectly according to its own logic, and imperfectly according to ours. One reason the Ozarks resist explanation is scale. From the ground, everything feels close. Trees limit vision, hills block horizons. Movement happens in small increments. But when something goes wrong, that small-scale experience clashes with the true size of the landscape. Distances compound quietly. A wrong turn doesn't feel like a mistake because it doesn't look dramatic. It just leads somewhere else. This mismatch between perceived scale and actual scale creates blind spots. People underestimate how much ground they have covered. Searchers underestimate how many places a person could have reached. The land exploits no one, but it also corrects no one. It allows errors to expand without comment. Another reason secrets persist is fragmentation. The Ozarks are not one continuous wilderness. They are broken into parcels of public land, private property, conservation areas, and unmanaged forest. Jurisdiction changes without visible markers. Records are kept separately. Searches are coordinated across boundaries that do not exist on the ground. This fragmentation complicates reconstruction. Even when every organization involved does its job well, the story remains split across reports, memories, and maps that do not align perfectly. Gaps form, not because information is hidden, but because it is distributed unevenly. The land itself contributes to this fragmentation. Surface features do not tell the whole story. Caves, sinkholes, and underground streams create vertical complexity that defies surface logic. A person can move from visible to invisible without travelling far horizontally. Searches that focus on spread miss depth. Searches that focus on depth cannot cover everything safely. Weather erases context. Rain smooths footprints. Wind redistributes scent. Seasonal growth hides what was once visible. Time works against clarity here, not by destroying evidence dramatically, but by softening it until it blends back into the environment. Even human memory collaborates in this erasure. Witnesses remember impressions more than details. Distances blur, times compress. Early assumptions influence later recall. By the time a disappearance is discussed publicly, the narrative has already shifted subtly from what actually happened. The Ozarks also keep secrets because they do not behave consistently. The same trail can feel clear one day and confusing the next. Conditions change without warning. Light, sound, and orientation behave differently depending on weather, season, and time of day. What works once does not always work again. This inconsistency undermines learning. People return to places believing past success guarantees future safety. When that assumption fails, it does so quietly, without alerting them until correction is difficult. Search efforts, no matter how skilled, are constrained by probability. Teams must decide where to look based on limited information. Every decision excludes other possibilities. When remains are later found outside search areas, it feels like failure, but it often reflects the impossibility of covering every outcome. The Ozarks keep secrets not because no one looks hard enough, but because looking hard enough everywhere is not feasible. The land does not concentrate clues, it disperses them. There is also a cultural dimension. Stories fade, attention moves on. New hikers arrive without awareness of what came before. The forest does not mark its history. It does not memorialize. Without active remembrance, events dissolve into the background. Families carry these secrets differently. For them, the story does not fade. It remains immediate, unresolved. The contrast between personal loss and public forgetting deepens the sense that something is being kept from them, even when no one is withholding anything intentionally. The Ozarks also challenge the idea that every question deserves an answer. Modern thinking encourages resolution, investigation, closure, but some environments do not cooperate with that framework. They produce outcomes without explanations proportionate to their impact. This does not mean the disappearances are unknowable. It means they are not neatly knowable. Pieces can be understood, patterns can be identified, risks can be reduced, but a complete account in many cases remains out of reach. That gap is uncomfortable. It tempts speculation. It invites myth. It encourages people to fill silence with meaning. But silence in this context may simply be the absence of sufficient data. The Ozarks keep their secrets because they are not designed to tell stories. They are designed by erosion, growth, collapse, and time. Human stories enter briefly, leave marks that fade and move on. What remains is not a mystery in the dramatic sense, but a reminder that landscapes can be deceptively gentle, that familiarity can be misleading, that absence does not always point to extraordinary causes, and yet the persistence of these secrets matters. It shapes how people feel about the region. It influences how hikers move. It alters how searchers approach the land. It leaves a residue of caution that does not require explanation to exist. As this journey approaches its final movement, the focus shifts once more, away from why the Ozarks keep their secrets, and toward what it means to leave them behind, to step back out of the forest carrying questions rather than answers, to return to ordinary life changed slightly by the awareness that not everything encountered can be resolved. That awareness lingers, quietly, long after the trail ends. Leaving the forest rarely feels like an ending. There is no clear line where the woods release you and certainty returns. The trees thin gradually. The ground firms up. Sounds shift from wind and leaves to engines and distant voices. The transition is subtle enough that it barely registers, even after everything that has been considered, everything that has been left unresolved. For most people, stepping back onto a road or into a parking area brings relief. The tension that built quietly without being noticed begins to loosen. The body relaxes, breathing deepens, the mind starts reorienting toward familiar structures. Time feels normal again. Space feels contained. The forest recedes behind the eyes, even if it lingers in thought. What remains, though, is not fear. It is a question. Not a sharp one. Not something that demands an immediate answer, but something that settles gently and stays. It is the awareness that the landscape you just left did not change while you were there, and it will not change after you're gone. It does not adjust its behaviour to match understanding. For those who have followed the stories of the Ozark Triangle, this question often takes the same shape. Why do some people return without incident, while others disappear without explanation? It is tempting to frame this as injustice, or randomness, or something hidden, but it may be closer to alignment. A particular set of conditions lining up quietly without intention. When people leave the forest, they often replay their movements, where they turned, where they paused, where things felt slightly unclear. This reflection is usually casual, a mental review rather than an interrogation. Most of the time, nothing seems significant enough to dwell on. But after hearing these stories, small details gain weight. A moment of hesitation, a trail that felt longer than expected, a bend that didn't quite match memory. These moments are easy to dismiss when nothing goes wrong. They become meaningful only in retrospect, and only because of what might have happened instead. This is the uncomfortable truth that lingers. Many disappearances are not the result of dramatic missteps. They are the result of ordinary moments unfolding in environments that quietly amplify consequences. Carrying that awareness does not require fear. It requires humility. An understanding that preparation is not just about equipment, but about mindset. About recognizing how easily perception can drift. About knowing that familiarity is not protection. For hikers, this awareness often changes behavior subtly. They check maps more often. They mark time intentionally. They pause earlier when something feels unclear. They communicate plans more precisely. These changes do not come from anxiety. They come from respect. Respect does not mean assuming danger everywhere. It means acknowledging complexity without demanding mastery. It means accepting that some environments reward attention and punish assumption. The Ozarks, for all their gentleness, ask for this kind of respect quietly. They do not intimidate. They do not posture. They simply continue being what they are, regardless of how they are perceived. For families who have lost someone, leaving the forest is not a metaphor. It is a reality they are forced into. They carry the question not as curiosity but as absence. Their relationship with the land is forever altered. Trails become references rather than experiences. Forests become places where stories stopped. Nothing said here resolves that loss. No explanation restores what is missing. The question remains because it must. It becomes part of how those families move through the world. For others, the question becomes quieter over time. It fades into background awareness. It surfaces occasionally, perhaps when passing a trailhead or when the woods close in along a road. It does not demand attention. It simply exists. This quiet persistence may be the most honest outcome. Not closure, but understanding that closure is not always possible, that some stories end without punctuation. Leaving the forest does not mean leaving the story behind. The land continues. So do the questions it raises. They are carried forward, woven into how people think about safety, exploration, and the limits of explanation. In this way, the Ozark Triangle is less a place than a reminder that the ordinary can conceal complexity, that calm can coexist with risk, that silence does not imply nothing happened. As you settle back into wherever you are now, the contrast between the forest and your surroundings may feel sharper or softer than before. That contrast will blur again with time. Daily life has a way of reasserting itself. But somewhere in the background, the question remains, not asking to be solved, only acknowledged. A question shaped like a pause rather than a demand. And perhaps that is where this journey leaves us. Not at an answer, but at the edge of understanding. Stepping away from the trees, carrying with us a deeper awareness of how easily paths can diverge, how quietly certainty can dissolve, and how some places do not offer explanations, only the space to consider them. Thank you for spending this time here, for listening, for moving through these thoughts at an unhurried pace. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, may the rest of your night or day unfold gently,